Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Stop Being Reasonable, How We Really Change Our Minds by Eleanor Gordon Smith. This is from the introduction. Somewhere in the technological belt of California, where the only thing more precisely engineered than the software is the people, or maybe the people's teeth, lives an organization called the Center for Applied Rationality. For the low price of $3,900, the center will sell you a 4-day workshop on reasoning, during which participants eat, sleep, and take part in 9 hours of back-to-back activities together daily under one, presumably rationally designed roof. This year, like every other year, the center will receive hundreds of applications from people who want to attend because, as they put it, everyone I know is irrational and I want to fix them. These folks make for an easy punchline, a good group to laugh at, but it turns out many of us make a version of the same mistake when we think about persuasion. We think we know what it is to change our minds rationally, and the only question is why other people don't do it more often. The ideal mind change is calm. It reacts to reasoned argument. It responds to facts, not to our sense of self or the people around us. It resists the siren song of emotion. People like to talk about the public sphere, if there is such a thing, then its convex edge reflects this idealized image back at us. Think of the number of programs dedicated to the mind-changing magic of two sides saying opposite things. Meet the Press, State of the Union, Face the Nation. The branding of these things often bakes in a little reward. How brave I am for attending the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. How clever for my subscription to the Intelligence Squared debates. The proper way to reason, at least according to our present ideal, is to discard ego and emotion and step into a kind of disinfected argumentative operating theater where the sealed air conditioning vents stop any everyday fluff from floating down and infecting the sterilized truth. Years ago, I used to share this view. I'll tell you why, even though it will rightly want to make you take my lunch money. When I was in school, I was a champion debater, which was another way of saying I spent my weekends wearing a blazer and telling people in precisely timed intervals exactly how wrong they were. My teammates and I constructed arguments for 20 hours a week, putting premises in the crosshairs with the unblinking accuracy of people whose whole egos were on the line. We weren't bad either. Eventually, we made it to the World Championships in Qatar, where we wore blazers embroidered with the Australian coat of arms in gold and competed in what looked, in hindsight, like a scene in an apocalypse movie just before the purge begins. All of us in matching uniforms on fleets of white buses being shepherded through the desert haze to auditoriums where we would sit locked up together for an hour, surrounded by stopwatch-wielding officials. Debating left me with an attitude toward persuasion that was as precise as Euclidean geometry. Find the foundation, show why it's wrong. Buttress analysis with evidence. Emotion is for decorative flourishes only. Do not expect it to be load-bearing. Of course, I knew you could change minds by appealing to things like emotion or your opponent's sense of self, but doing that seemed kind of base. It felt nobly sportsmanlike to arm yourself with argument alone. It was the intellectual equivalent of turning up at dawn for your duel with your pistols shined and paces counted. It was how you were meant to fight. This perspective began to change after I produced a piece for the radio show This American Life in 2016. The idea had seemed simple. Turn around to my own catcallers, men who had wolf whistled or made sexual comments to me on the street, and try to reason them out of doing it again. I spent hours giving these men all the evidence, all the reasoning, all the fancy footwork with premises. But after dozens of conversations, I walked away defeated. Over and over again, they walked away from our conversations as sure as they'd ever been that it was okay to grab, yell at, or follow women on the street. These men didn't seem fundamentally irrational or unstuck from reality. In fact, in a funny sort of way, I quite liked a few of them. One told me he modeled his courtship rituals on the animal kingdom. "I'm just another paradise bird flaunting my stuff," he said triumphantly, as though this explained everything that needed to be explained. That's a good line. He made me laugh, but I couldn't change their minds. The experience deflated me, not just as a person and as a woman, but as someone who has always been optimistic about our ability to talk each other into better beliefs. We finished recording in November 2016, right after the U.S. general election, which set up a grim backdrop for a newly found pessimism toward rational debate and persuasion. But when the piece aired, a strange thing happened. I was inundated with interview requests. Could I write a 10-step guide to changing minds? Would I accept an award for the successful use of rational persuasion in public? What advice did I have for talking people out of being workplace harassers? I was astonished. Large numbers of people had apparently listened to my conversations with catcallers on the radio, conversations that I had walked away from feeling dejected and defeated, and heard instead instances of persuasive success. I think the explanation is that these conversations bore a sort of Madame Tussauds-like resemblance to what we think good mind changes look like. I said one thing, my catcaller said the opposite thing, and each of us tried to explain why we were right. I had stayed calm. They had been prepared to hear me out. I had used statistics. It looked for all the world like a rational debate, and the fact that I had failed to change any minds with this approach disappeared under the shadow of the unquestioned assumption that I deserved congratulations for even trying. I started to smell a rat. The book Stop Being Reasonable by Eleanor Gordon Smith. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann program on.
This is the Thom Hartmann program.
Well, happy Monday. It's Indigenous Peoples Day. It used to be called Columbus Day. And we're going to riff about that just a little bit. There is an ongoing human rights disaster on the ground in northern Syria, and a complete geopolitical realignment going on there, which I think is very consequential. We'll talk about that in just a moment. In our second hour, Stephen Hassan or Hassan, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Hassan is how it's pronounced. An expert on undue influence, brainwashing, and unethical hypnosis is going to be on. He's written a new book called The Cult of Trump. And this is a fascinating premise, that people who follow Trump are not your normal political junkies, that they are actually cult followers, and that you have to deal with Trump as if he was a cult leader. I broached this subject a year and a half ago in a speech that I gave in Minneapolis at the Blue State Ball for KTNF. And haven't much talked about it on the air since then. I've been seriously thinking about writing a book, but I've been so busy, writing this book on monopoly and the book on voting, which the voting book will be out next spring, that I just haven't really dug into it or had the time, really, frankly. But it's going to be interesting. And in our third hour, we're going to dig deep into this issue of why the Republicans keep insisting on letting Americans die just to keep taxes low on rich people, and to enhance the profits of the healthcare industry. So there's a lot going on in the 3 hours of our program here. Just to start here, the Kurdish forces, this from the Financial Times, Kurdish forces say they have struck a deal with Syria and Russia to stop the Turks. Now, the Turks have also, I'll just finish the sentence from the Financial Times. In a dramatic shift that came just hours after Donald Trump ordered the evacuation of the remaining U.S. forces in the country's northeast. Northeast Syria is a huge territory. It was controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces. We call them the Kurds in shorthand, and in fact, the majority of them are Kurds. But there are also, in that region, there are Christian villages and a lot of Christians in those areas, and there are some other Arabs in those areas. some Shia, some Sunni. I mean, basically the Kurds, this fighting force, the Syrian Democratic Force, their whole thing was, we're not a religious force. We are not like an Islamic government, which is why it's a coalition of Kurds, who have one variety of Islam, some Sunni, some Shia, and a lot of Christian fighters. And Trump has just turned all of them over to Syria. And Syria, of course, has a strong alliance with Russia. Russia has a major naval base there and in Syria, which is, one of the reasons that they've been, working with Bashar al-Assad to stabilize that country. And now Turkey has bought major anti-missile defense systems over the objections of the United States and NATO. Has bought these defense systems from Russia. So Erdogan has his own relationship with Russia. And in the meantime, Turkey is a member of NATO and has nuclear weapons based in Turkey. One of the things I've been trying to find out and have not been able to, frankly, is, and maybe if you know, give us a shout, is to what extent, is exactly who controls the nuclear weaponry that is in Turkey. Whether it's, placed there by NATO itself, by the United States, by one of the NATO states. The major nuclear-armed NATO states are France and the UK. I just don't know. But what has happened is that a substantial region, and by the way, a region rich in oil, surprise, surprise, that was under the control of the Syrian democratic forces, that is to say the Kurds, the Christians, these local people who lived there, that was under their control, has now been turned over, essentially. Part of it has been taken over by Turkey, and they're slaughtering people. I mean, they're uploading videos of Turkish forces or fighters loyal to the Turkish forces beheading Kurds and Christians and others. I mean, this has gotten very, very gory and gruesome. And thousands of ISIS fighters and apparently tens of thousands of ISIS sympathizers and family members have escaped, as the Kurds have had to leave these prisons to go north to literally defend their families. I mean, they live here too, or they did live there. These ISIS fighters and their force and their families and relatives, including a whole bunch of, quote, high-value ISIS members who the plan was to deport these people either to Europe or the United States so that they could stand trial. They have escaped. So it's like, and in some places now in Syria, the ISIS flag is flying again. Thank you, Donald Trump. This is an extraordinary event, and it seems like the principal beneficiary of it, in terms of power in the region, is going to be Russia. That may not be a terrible thing if that means that the region stabilizes, but on the other hand, it could be very, very problematic for. Well, it almost certainly would be very problematic for the Kurds. I mean, the Kurds are now aligning themselves, they're having to align themselves with Bashar al-Assad, with Syria and with Russia, and yet Assad has, basically throughout his presidency, and his father as well, before him, been at a low level of war with the Kurds. And Turkey has their own problem with the Kurds. Nobody in these regions like the Kurds there, because the Kurds have always been there, and the Kurds would like autonomy, and the Kurds, frankly, in my opinion, deserve autonomy. They deserve their own state, and they should take a piece of, northwestern Iraq and northeastern Syria and southwestern Iran and southern Turkey. That's the old Kurdistan, and it should be the current Kurdistan, but the Kurds are finding themselves in this horrible, horrible position right in the middle. And, Donald Trump is just, I used to say about George W. Bush that when he lied us he and Dick Cheney lied us illegally, committed war crimes and treason against the American people, frankly. Lied us into a multi-trillion-dollar war in Iraq that has led to the death of thousands of American soldiers. You know, more people have died there than died in 9/11, and Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. And now Donald Trump is in my opinion, another man who is a traitor to American values and to his country, is saying, oh, well, we're pulling these support troops. These are not combat troops that we had in Syria. I mean, they weren't engaged. Obviously, any troops are capable of engaging in combat, but that wasn't their role. Their role was to provide logistical and technical support to the Kurds, or actually to the Syrian Democratic Force, the Kurds and the Christians. And, you know, Trump has just said, screw you to them. But when Mohammed bin Salman, you know, Mr. Bonesaw, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the despotic ruler of you know, one of the most brutal tyrannies in the world, has said, hey, we need some help defending our oil fields. Trump sends 1,800 soldiers. Boom, just like that. So there's that. A couple hundred people last night showed up in Fort Worth, Texas, for a vigil. Atiana, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her first name, and I haven't heard it on the news. CNN is talking about it right now, but I can't listen to CNN and talk to you at the same time. But Tatiana Jefferson, I'm pretty sure is probably how her name is pronounced. Again, she was in her house. Here's this woman, this 28-year-old woman, in her house playing video games with her 7-year-old nephew, and the back door was open apparently, or ajar, and a next door neighbor calls the police and says, you know, with good intentions, says, you know, the back door of the house next door is open, you might want to just check and make sure everything's okay. And so, you know, a cop shows up, sees her through the window, and shoots her. And, you know, they're playing video games. Maybe he thought the video game controller was a gun or something. I don't know. But whatever he thought, there was, I mean, this certainly looks like another, you know, oh my God, I was afraid. It was black people. White cop killing in Texas. So, you know, but to just finalize my rant here on Trump and Syria. I think the biggest question is, why has not Congress acted? Congress has the sole power to declare war according to the Constitution. The last time we declared war was World War II. We had the Korean conflict, we had the Vietnam War, we've had, you know, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. We've had involvement in all these countries. And none of them have been declared wars. And this authorization to use military force is a complete BS, smokescreen, fig leaf, whatever you want to call it. Congress needs to say we are or we are not at war. And if we are at war someplace, we need to authorize it. We need to define it. We need to define our goals. We need to tell the American people and Congress what victory will look like and what will happen when it's over and what we will do. You know, that's what you do with a war. And if we're not willing to declare a war, we need to get the hell out. Not necessarily in the way that Trump is removing people from Syria. I mean, we need to get out in a way that is reasonable and rational and step-by-step and that protects our interests in the region, or frankly, better said, we need to protect the interests of democracy. The Kurds, for example, keep trying to create democratic governments. But they've had 5 Republican presidents in a row betray them. Richard Nixon betrayed the Kurds, Ronald Reagan betrayed the Kurds, George Herbert Walker Bush betrayed the Kurds in a way that led to the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of them in Iraq when he encouraged them to rise up against Saddam, and then the U.S. refused to intervene. George W. Bush betrayed the Kurds in 2007, and now Donald Trump is betraying the Kurds. So why doesn't Congress, which has the sole power to authorize war, why isn't Congress acting? I realize, you know, Nancy Pelosi is pushing through a resolution in the House of Representatives. I think we need a hell of a lot more than that. And I think that, you know, and what's Moscow Mitch up to? God only knows.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
On top of that, it's Indigenous Peoples Day. I've got my annual riff about that, excerpted from my book, The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, about who was Columbus really? And welcome back. Morris in Long Beach, California. Hey, Morris, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Professor, I just wanted to say thank you. Say Happy Indigenous Peoples Day.
Oh.
You know, this is a damn shame. Putin owns everything that's for sale except salvation from Christ. You know that. But Putin owns the U.S. president. Russia has bought, they own our U.S. president. You know
it's
about
increasingly looking that way. I mean, you know, it's been looking that way in some ways from day one, but it's, I don't know why the American media keeps, shying away from that explicit statement, Morris.
Well, straight up, it's obvious to everybody, and the reason why Congress hasn't done anything, Professor, now come on, now you're an educated man. There is no honor among thieves.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well said. Jared in Downington, Pennsylvania. Hey, Jared, what's up?
Hello, Tom. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day.
Thank you. Back at you.
Well, since we're on the topic of traitors, do you want to know who the first, what state the first Union general who won the first battle of the Civil War for the Union was?
I have no idea. I'd love to know.
He was from Virginia.
Oh, that's interesting. Virginia was part of the Confederacy.
Yeah. Also, Winfield Scott, who came up with the Anaconda Plan, was also from Virginia, and he was the first.
So a Union general was from Virginia? Or he just won in Virginia?
No, he was from Virginia, literally, born and raised.
Wow.
Yeah, and Winfield Scott, who came up with the Anaconda Plan, he was the first general under Lincoln before being,
What was the Anaconda Plan?
It was to cut off the South, the Mississippi River, and...
this was a war strategy?
Yeah, it was like, and like an anaconda, like, a snake, wrapping around a prey.
Sure.
But anyway, let me get back to my plan. My phone call. Trump is obviously a traitor to the country. But the real question is, what can be done about that? And increasingly, it looks like Nancy Pelosi is also, I hate to say this, but basically a traitor herself.
That's pretty strong language.
Well, what has she done to stop Donald Trump? Nothing.
Oh, no, she has started an impeachment hearing. She has, I think she's done about as much as she can to stop Donald Trump. And I'm generally no Pelosi apologist, but, he is stonewalling all these committees, and I mean, what do you want her to do? She can't, anything she passes, she's passed 280 pieces of legislation now that are sitting in the graveyard that is Mitch McConnell's desk.
She could stop all legislation from passing, like all these like war bills. I mean, she doesn't have to pass any of these things. I've been talking about this for a while now. I mean, at this point, they're just basically just giving Trump the power to do whatever the hell he wants.
Yeah.
And
I think the defunding, for example, the White House counsel's office is a good idea right now. Although I'm sure she won't do that because that would be viewed as too partisan. And I think that digging into the military budget right now is a good idea too, because I think parts of that run out at the end of this month. Jared, thanks for the call. We'll be back. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. So it's Indigenous Peoples Day. Elizabeth Warren tweeted out, "The story of America's mistreatment of Indigenous people is long and painful, and yet Native communities have proven resilient. We owe them our respect, and we must honor our government's commitments and promises to them." Hashtag Indigenous Peoples Day. Yes. Amen. And I'm sure probably most of the other presidential candidates also tweeted out something similar to that. What I wanted to share with you is the exact story. I mean, you know, this used to be Columbus Day, and in some states it still is Columbus Day. And I think that this, you know, this is an important part of our history. This was the founding, basically, of the European Empire on North America. It started, of course, with the island of Hispaniola, which is now known, half of it is known as Haiti and half of it is known as the Dominican Republic, split between basically the French colony half and the Spanish colony half, and now they're two independent nations. But that's where Columbus blundered into, thinking he had hit the continental United States. In 1503, in a letter to the King and Queen of Spain, he wrote, "Gold is most excellent. Gold constitutes treasure, and he who has it does all he wants in the world and can even lift souls up to paradise." This was his sales pitch, you know, for his second trip. You know, I think we'll find gold. But Miguel Cuneo was a member of Columbus's crew. He was literate. He was actually quite a competent writer. He kept the diary for the trip, and he wrote, "When our caravels were to leave for these are the, you know, there are three ships, were to leave for Spain, we gathered 1,000. This is, you know, from Hispaniola. Were to leave for Spain, we gathered 1,600 male and female persons of those Indians, and we embarked on our caravels on February 17th, 1495. So they took 1,600 men and women from the island that they were taking back to Europe to sell as slaves. And then he adds, for those who remained, for the soldiers who stayed, in other words, they built a fortress there, and we let it be known to the Spaniards who manned the island's fort in the vicinity that anyone who wanted to take some of them could do so, to the amount desired, which was done. In other words, the local Spaniards who got to stay could make slaves out of the local Indians that they had conquered. Queno says that Columbus himself gave him a beautiful teenage girl, a Carib girl, and when he attempted to have sex with her, and this is quoting his own diary, quote, "She resisted me with all her strength. I thrashed her mercilessly and raped her." He was quite apparently proud of that. Columbus wrote to the Spanish monarchs in 1493, quote, "It is possible, with the name of the Holy Trinity, to sell all the slaves which it is possible to sell. Here there are so many of these slaves, and also Brazil wood, that although they are living things, they're as good as gold." Basically, he didn't find any gold there. But what he did find was, you know, potential slaves and wood. In 1500, he wrote to a friend of his, this is Christopher Columbus, 100 castellanos, as a Spanish coin, are as easily obtained for a woman as for a farm. And it is very general, and there are plenty of dealers who go about looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 years old are now the most in demand. The Taino didn't particularly like this, the Indians. When Columbus wanted to impose, for even a minor offense, an Indian's nose or ear was cut off so they could impress people with their brutality. Columbus attacked them with dogs, skewered them with pikes, and shot them. Eventually, life became so unbearable that, as Pedro de Cordoba wrote, the Indians choose and have chosen suicide.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
The Indians engaged in mass suicide for a couple of generations, to the point that there were none left by 1455, or 1555. It's amazing. Welcome to the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Settlers, the Mythology of the White Proletariat, the True Story of the White Nation by J. Sakai, published by Morningstar Press in 1989. This is from Chapter 2, The Foundations of Settler Life. The life of European settlers and the class structure of their society was abnormal because it was dependent upon a foundation of conquest, genocide, and enslavement.
The myth of the self-sufficient white settler family clearing the wilderness and supporting themselves through their own initiative and hard labor is a propaganda fabrication. It is the absolute characteristic of settler society to be parasitic, dependent upon the super-exploitation of oppressed peoples for its style of life. Never has Euro-American society completely supported itself. This is the decisive factor in the consciousness of all classes and strata of white society from 1600 to now. Settler society was raised up above the level of backward old Europe by a foundation of conquest. This conquest was a miracle drug for a Europe convulsed with the reaction of decaying feudalism and deadly capitalism. Shot into the veins of the Spanish feudal nation, for instance, the miracle drug of the New World conquest gave Spain the momentary power to overrun North Africa, Holland, and Italy before her historical incident waned. Like many such fixes for Euro-Americans, this conquest was addicting. It was habit-forming and rapidly indispensable, not only culturally, but in the mechanism of an oppressor society whose lifeblood was new conquest. We'll examine this later in the relationship of settlerism to imperialism. For now, it's enough to see that this conquest is a material act of great magnitude, an economic and social event as important as the emergence of the factory system or the exploitation of petroleum in the Middle East. We stress the obvious here because the Euro-American settlers have always made light of their invasion and occupation, although the conquered territory is the precondition for their whole society. Traditionally, European settler societies throw off the propaganda smoke screens that they didn't really conquer and dispossess other nations. They claim with false modesty that they merely moved into vacant territory. So the early English settlers depicted America as empty, a howling wilderness, unsettled, sparsely populated, just waiting with a vacant sign on the door for the first lucky civilization to walk in and claim it. Theodore Roosevelt wrote defensively in 1900, quote, "The settler and pioneer have at bottom had justice on their side. This great continent could not have been kept as nothing but a game preserve for squalid savages," end of quote. It is telling that this lie is precisely the same lie put forward by white Afrikaner settlers who claim that South Africa was literally totally uninhabited by any Africans when they arrived from Europe. To universal derision, these European settlers claim to be the only rightful historic inhabitants of South Africa. Or we can hear similar defenses put forward by the European settlers of Israel, who claim that much of the Palestinian land and buildings they occupy are rightfully theirs, since the Arabs had allegedly decided to voluntarily abandon it all during the 1948-49 war. Are these kinds of tales any less preposterous than those put forward by Euro-American settlers? America was spacious and sparsely populated only because the European invaders destroyed whole civilizations and killed off millions of Native Americans to get the land and profits they wanted. We all know that when the English arrived at Virginia, for example, they encountered an urban, village-dwelling society far more skilled than they were in the arts of medicine, agriculture, fishing, and government. This civilization was reflected in a chain of 300 Indian nations and peoples stretching from the Arctic Circle to the tip of South America, many of whom had highly developed societies. There was, in fact, a greater population in these Indian nations in 1492 than in all of Western Europe. Recent scholarly estimates indicate that at the time of Columbus, there were 100 million Indians in the hemisphere, 10 million in North America, 25 million in Central Mexico, and an additional 65 million elsewhere in Central and South America. These numbers have long been concealed since they give rise to the logical question of what happened to this great mass of people. The European invaders, Spanish, Dutch, English, Portuguese, and French, simply killed off millions and millions to safeguard their conquest of the land and provide the disposable slave labor they needed to launch their new world. Conservative Western historical estimates show that the Spanish reduced, in quotes, the Indian population of their colonies from some 50 million to only 4 million by the end of the 17th century. And from the 10 million Indians who once inhabited North America, after 4 centuries of settler invasion and rule, there were in 1900 perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 surviving descendants in the United States. This was the very substantial down payment towards the continuing blood price that third world nations have to pay to sustain the Euro-American way of life. So when we hear that the settlers pushed out the Indians or forced the Indians to leave their traditional hunting grounds, we know that these are just code phrases to refer politely to the most barbaric genocide imaginable. It could well be the greatest crime in all of human history. Only here, the Adolf Eichmanns and Heinrich Himmlers had names like Benjamin Franklin and Andrew Jackson. The point is that genocide was not an accident, not an excess, not the unintended side effect of virile European growth. Genocide was the necessary and deliberate act of the capitalists and their settler shock troops. The book Settlers. It's past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you, fair and only slightly unbalanced. The Washington Post's Jackson Deal writing an op-ed today. In a month, Trump has destroyed, quote, America first, end quote. And it points out, trying to negotiate with the Taliban, something that he was going to bring to Camp David just before 9/11. The Taliban, of course, had sheltered Osama bin Laden when he plotted 9/11, which is insane. I mean, I think working out a deal with the Taliban and getting us the hell out of Afghanistan is a very good idea. I think trying to do it as a publicity stunt the week before 9/11 is a very stupid idea. But that fell apart. The Saudis got the message that they can do pretty much whatever they want. North Korea has gotten that message. They're now firing off missiles with multiple warheads from submarines, something that not only are they not supposed to be doing, but we didn't even think was within their capability. They're rapidly developing an expanded nuclear capability. Is Trump going to betray South Korea next? Is Trump going to betray Taiwan next? I mean, I guarantee you these countries are sitting around saying, okay, he betrayed the Kurds in northern Syria, who fought on behalf of the United States and other countries against ISIS. He has betrayed his European allies repeatedly, condemning NATO and all these sorts of things. Is he going to betray us next? Is South Korea going to fall to North Korea? Is there going to, what is the next thing that's going to happen? How bad is it going to get? I think it's just astonishing. Mike in Lomita, California, there was an impeachment rally in Los Angeles yesterday.
Yes, one of I think it was hundreds across the country, and it was a pretty remarkable sight. There were something like 200 or more pro-impeachment demonstrators in front of the federal building in Westwood, and something like 4 or 5 pro-Trump people yelling back at them.
Wow.
My favorite sight was, and it showed up on the local ABC News, was a guy in the whole Trump outfit with a Trump mask, wearing a rigged witch hat, and holding a sign that said, "Betrayal is my only skill,"
right?
Which sort of characterizes Trump, I think. Oh, by the way, every time we talk about American Indians, we're making a Columbus joke because he thought he was in India.
Right.
That's the name.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Mr. Incompetent. He blundered into the wrong continent, gave it the wrong name, and it's incredible.
If he'd hung out in Scandinavia more, he might have figured out there was a North America, but he didn't know there was such a thing.
Yeah, no, the Norwegians were here 400 years before Columbus, and it's now well established. And they knew it was another continent, and they put it on their maps, and but he blundered into it. And in fact, even the name America came from the map maker. It was Amerigo Vespucci, and he put his name down on the lower right-hand corner of the map, and people thought, oh, that's the name of the country. Mike, thanks for the call, and thanks for the update on what's going on there, and I appreciate you listening to KPFK. Scott in Topanga, California, you say Columbus actually knew he wasn't in India.
From what I read, and I wish I could remember the book I read it in, it was a textbook. Europeans knew how people in India dressed, what their customs were,
sure,
what they looked like, and he could, he knew he was not.
No, but did he not think that he had discovered essentially the equivalent of Ceylon, Sri Lanka, an
From what I read, no. And not only that, but the name Indian had nothing to do with India, according to this. It was because of Columbus's that he was Italian. He was not Spanish, right? His Spanish wasn't great. In his log, he wrote that he found that the English translation would be, he found the people to be a people in God. Now, in Spanish, that would have been spelled in D-I-O-S.
Yeah, in Deus.
And he spelled it wrong. He combined the two words.
Yeah.
And,
Scott, if you can come up with an authoritative source for that and let me know what it is. It sounds like a fascinating bit of history. But for the moment, I'm going with Columbus was an idiot. I appreciate your call, but it's, I'll take the cheap shot. I'm fine with that. Phil in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Hey, Phil. You want Columbus Day back?
Columbus.
Seriously?
Happy Columbus Day, Tom.
Is that an Italian thing or is that an American jingoistic thing?
No. Well, I'm an Italian American, and I'm 100% against the states and the cities taken away.
Well, why not have an Italian American Day? A separate day.
Well, it's morphed into that. Columbus Day is morphed into with.
I know it did that. It did that in the late 1800s, in the early 20th century, as the Italians were emerging, particularly in New York City, emerging out of the the wars against the Irish and the British ancestry Europeans here, and quote, becoming white. I mean, there's a fascinating new book about this called, When the Italians Became White, which is kind of following on the book about 5 or 6 years ago, When the Irish Became White, and talks about that and how Columbus Day was, their day. And I get all that, but Columbus was also, a vicious murderer, a slaver, a rapist, a thief. Don't you think that celebrating your Italian heritage would be better served by honoring somebody like Leonardo da Vinci?
Well, the thing is, like I said, it morphed into that, but it's spiteful. He's become a scapegoat for like the Trail of Tears, Custer's and reservations, etc.
Well, he started the process.
Well, maybe he did, but we did the rest.
Well, no denying that, but still, he started the process. I don't see what about Columbus is worthy of any kind of memorialization. And were I Italian, I'm Norwegian American, right? I'm 48% Norwegian, and I don't. If Anders Breivik, the guy who murdered 70 liberals at that summer camp, who's the Norwegian in Norway. If he had been some major historical figure, I wouldn't be saying, hey, us people of Norwegian ancestry should have an Anders Breivik Day. I just don't get why Italians like you, Phil, would want Columbus to be your logo. You've got some brilliant Italians. You've got philosophers, you've got mathematicians, you've got scientists, you've got brilliant artists, you've got a lot of popes. Can't you figure out a different logo for your Italian American Day?
I'm just saying, just leave it alone. I'm totally for an Indigenous Peoples Day, totally for it, but not Columbus Day. Pick out any day of the year, or a holiday that we don't use anymore, like Arbor Day. Give that to them.
Yeah.
It's just there's millions of people that celebrate Columbus Day. That's all I know. There's parades here in Philadelphia. There's festivals going on at churches now, and it's a Columbus Day celebration. Yeah. Just like the Irish people, they celebrate St. Patty's Day. That's their holiday.
I get it. I'm just saying. I think that ship has sailed. I think this is gaining momentum, and it's going to gain more momentum. And if you want to have an Italian American Day and have parades and events in towns and communities that are largely Italian American ancestry, I would suggest picking a different logo and a different day. But Phil, it's your people, your thing. Good luck with it. Thanks a lot for the call, Pam in Chicago. Hey, Pam, let's get back to the Kurds.
Hi, Tom. How are you?
I'm well. What's on your mind, Pam?
Tom, regarding the Kurds, sure. Thank you. My concern is I think one of the soldiers, Tom, made a comment that this was the first time that they felt ashamed.
Yes, that was one of the Green Berets. Yep.
Okay, yes. They felt like they were abandoning their allies, people that they've worked closely with. So I wanted to ask you, what is the reason Trump is doing this? And I don't care what he says or what the White House is saying.
Right.
I believe it is because there is a benefit to Russia and Putin. And I think we need to just state it and say it.
Yep.
So I'm asking you that. And Tom, I know your call screener said one thing. Can I ask you one other question?
Sure. Yeah, that's okay, Pam.
And I understand. I'm upset, Tom, because I feel like black people can be accidentally shot, right by the police officers.
It wasn't accidental, but yes, I get your point.
So I'm concerned about that. But, Tom, can we win this election without Republican voters? And the reason I'm asking, because Trump supporters and the Republican voters are so dedicated to him.
Yeah.
And
we're going to be discussing that.
I don't want to worry about trying to win them. Can we do it?
Yeah, we can. We can.
Voters?
Pam, the number of people who identify themselves as Republicans prior to Trump's election, and in fact prior to Trump's nomination, was in the mid-30s. It was about a third of Americans. It's now in the high 20s. 27, 28% of Americans still call themselves Republicans. And of those people who still call themselves Republicans, only about 80% of them, 85% of them, are strong supporters of Donald Trump. So that's, you're pushing 21, 22% of the population. It's going to be easy, I believe, to win an election without Trump supporters. The challenge is going to be the people who are the low information voters, the people in the middle. That's part of the challenge. That's the conventional wisdom challenge that all the consultants are pushing. But I frankly think I push back on that. I think that the challenge for us is going to be getting out our base, getting out the people who traditionally haven't voted and need to vote, young people, communities of color, particularly Hispanics right now. African Americans are becoming more and more active. And in those communities where there has been active and aggressive voter suppression going on, working as hard as possible to overcome that voter suppression or to turn out in such overwhelming numbers that, if they can knock 1 million people off the voting rolls, we'll show up 3 million. That's what we've got to do.
I know, Tom, I'm going to do all that I can, and I'm going to encourage everybody that I know, because it is critical at this moment.
Yeah.
Trump is betraying the country.
Yeah, oh yeah,
and
absolutely.
I don't know.
And women, by the way. Women is the other, quote, minority group that need to get out there. But Pam, if I can answer your first question real quick, because I see the clock here and I know I'm going to hit a break in a second. I believe, my personal belief, and I have no evidence for this because we have not been allowed to see the transcripts of Trump's conversations with Erdogan, but we do know that back when Trump came, and this is on the record, we do know that back 2.5 years ago when Trump first compiled his Muslim country list for his Muslim ban, remember that Turkey was on that list. Erdogan called him up and said, I'm going to take your name off the Trump Towers here in Istanbul, and you're going to lose your $5 million a year in licensing fees. And Trump immediately took Turkey off the list. So I think that, knowing how craven and how purely personally motivated Trump is, how he bragged, after he was nominated that he would be the first person in history to profit off the presidency, I believe that Erdogan called up Trump and said, you've got 109 or 119 business interests in this country. You've got a Trump Tower in this country. You're going to lose it all if you don't let me take the Kurds out. I think that the principal beneficiary of this is Mr. Putin, President Putin, and Russia, but also Turkey. And I think that we could be seeing a process. One of two things is going to happen. When the Russian troops are coming up from the north, along with the Syrian troops, the Turkish troops are coming down from the south. They're catching the Kurds in the middle. The American troops are getting the hell out of the way. When those two groups meet, when the Turkish groups from the north meet the Russian and Syrian troops from the south, and it's actual Russian soldiers on the ground, the test is going to be, Turkey is going to have to say, okay, are we a NATO country, and are we going to defy Russia here and perhaps even engage in combat with them? Or are we going to go with Russia, which just sold a major defense and anti-missile defense system to Turkey? Are we going to turn our back on NATO and strengthen our alliance with Russia? And this is all of this, what we are watching is a dramatic change in the geopolitics of this region.
and the ascendance of Russia, the descendance of American influence, and thus the influence of small d democracies, democratic republics. So it's going to play out, Pam. I'm not sure how, but those are my thoughts on it. Thank you for the call.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archive.
On the other hand, it's entirely possible that Trump got a call from Putin who said, get the hell out of there. Those are my orders. And Trump said, sir, yes, sir. And we just don't even know about the phone call. Anything is possible. And welcome back. Actually, Jay, hang on. I want to get this into a different part of the show here. Denise in Benicia, California. Am I saying that right, Denise?
Yes, you are. Thank you very much, Tom. I really appreciate the program this morning and appreciate your time. I have a comment on the indigenous people of these lands. Mm-hmm. I am Muskogee Creek from Kyaligi Tribal Town, Bear Clan. Mm-hmm. Long before colonization, we were over 500 distinct nations, and with languages and customs that were specific to the land, the surrounding waters, the mountains, the plains, and the deserts. Our tribal names are distinct languages, and they mean the people or the human beings.
Right, I understand that. Was that the was the point I wanted to make?
Just a comment to add, and historical. I'm sure you understand that. But
and that's not unique to Native Americans, by the way. Pretty much every people in the world, their word for themselves is also their word for human beings.
Yes, and our relationship to the earth, the planet, and all beings.
Yeah.
It's our single words, the reduction of the English language, which is often regarded as a trade language, has reduced us to such an elemental form that it has dispossessed us from our relationship, not only to ourselves, but to everything that was in our culture, in our ways of life, and our ways of being, to the extent that we live, all indigenous peoples of the earth, and that's our gift to everyone else who were trying to learn from us, and those who didn't understand and chose not to understand to learn from us tried to obliterate us, because that's what happens with human relationships, is that we destroy that which we don't understand. Which kind of brings us to full circle to where we all are right now in time, and that if we're not going to understand one another, and if we're not going to understand this earth, if we're not going to understand the waters, the atmosphere that feeds us and every other living thing on this earth, we will lose it. And that's the message that we're being given right now.
Yes, and our culture needs to hear. But I wrote about this in the last hours of Ancient Sunlight. Jack Forbes, Dr. Jack Forbes, was my teacher in this regard. He was a professor of Native American Studies at UC Berkeley, or UC Davis, excuse me. He was Native American himself. And he said that this Western culture that was brought to this country by Columbus and others, he described it using the word wetiko. And he said that means those who are cannibals, essentially, those who eat the spirits and the lives of others. And he said we were confronted with three choices. We could either stand and fight and in all probability die because of superior technology on the part of the Europeans. We could run, or we could become them. We could negotiate, actually, was his first one. That's how we first started out. Or we could become them and fight them. But he said many of us were not willing to become them, to become infected by Wetiko. And
exactly.
It's a powerful, powerful story. Denise, thank you for sharing your story with us. I appreciate the call. Thank you very much, and happy Indigenous Peoples Day. We'll be right back. Stick around. It's 52 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Jay in Seattle. Hey, Jay, what's on your mind today?
I was just calling with a few facts on Columbus that
go for it.
Really get. Okay, he thought the world was about, I think it's a third the size smaller than everyone knew it was.
Right.
Like, if you look up the globe, the oldest globe that still exists, I think it's in Germany. That was released about the same time he did his voyage.
So he did think that he had hit basically an island filled with Aboriginal people, indigenous people off the coast of India.
Correct. He was really bad at math.
Right.
He thought the world was teardrop shaped.
Right, because the Greeks actually, 3,000 years ago, the Greeks actually had calculated the diameter of the Earth, and I think that they pretty much assumed that there were continents to the west, but they were a whole lot closer. I mean, I think the circumference of the Earth is around 24,000 miles, as I recall, and I recall something. It wasn't Archimedes, but it was one of those guys. Basically calculated the diameter of the Earth within a few thousand miles of what it actually is, based on astronomy. They were basing that on how long it took the Earth to rotate relative to fixed bodies around it, as I recall. I mean, this is stuff I think I learned in high school.
Yeah, it's not only that in Egypt they used the way that the shadow fell. Might have been not the equinox.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, but again, that's the same thing, relative, how long it takes the Earth to rotate, how long it takes the Earth to rotate around the sun, as well as to rotate it on its axis. And from those things, they derived the size of the Earth.
Yeah, and he was just way off. No one wanted to make the voyage.
So Columbus was an idiot. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, that was fact one. Are there others?
Let's see. The shape of it was off. The weird Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, he believed was where he landed later. There was some weird stuff to kind of look into it, but he really thought it was kind of oval shaped, or not oval, teardrop shaped. The Earth itself.
Yeah.
So he was crazy.
All right, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate the call, Jay. Thank you, David in Pittsburgh. Hey, David, impeachment.
Yeah.
Over the weekend, I was in Denver for a board meeting of Vocal. It's a charitable organization I'm on their board of, and we were eating in a restaurant, and the menu for dessert was peach sorbet, and I said, I'll have some of that peachment sorbet, and the waitress started laughing, and she said, you're about the fourth person to say that today. Anyhow, back to you, David.
I
should call her a servant, not a waitress. Forgive me. But anyhow, back to you.
I have two questions. Yeah. One is the Patriot Act was passed when George Bush Jr. was in office, and that circumvented the House of Representatives to act as the war-powering.
In some ways, yeah, but it doesn't diminish the constitutional requirement that war begins with the House.
No. I'm saying it doesn't. What I'm saying is Congress lost the right to declare war because it went into the executive branch at that time.
I think you could argue that started with the Harry Truman administration and his, quote, police action in North Korea, which was what basically Jack Kennedy imitated in 1961 when he moved 15,000 troops into South Vietnam.
Okay.
So there's a long history to this. I'm just saying it's time for Congress to reclaim its own inherent constitutional power to declare and end wars.
Okay. The other question I have for you is the Judiciary Committee voted on articles of impeachment when Nixon was in office.
Right.
And once they voted on that, they took that to the House, and the House voted to impeach Nixon. Did they not?
No, they did not vote to impeach Nixon. David, thank you for the call. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Our book for today on the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Kingdom of Lies, Unnerving Adventures in the World of Cybercrime by Kate Fazzini. This is from the preface. It didn't take me long in my career as a cybersecurity executive to figure out everyone was lying to me. The biggest lie of all came at the very beginning, that cybersecurity is hard, too hard, certainly too difficult for someone who lacks years and years of deep technical training. That is no place for writers. That thicket of incomprehensible jargon alone seemed meant to discourage outsiders like me from entering the field. They told me I could never hope to understand the terminology unless I'd worked around it for a very long time, unless I had a special and complicated certification, unless I knew how to take apart and reassemble a computer, unless I knew how to code in Python and could read it, interpret it, and spot problems on sight. And if I somehow managed to learn the lingo, the learning curve for the rest of it would prove insurmountable. Lies, lies, lies. It's unfortunate because there's a huge gap between the demand for cybersecurity workers and the people available to fill those jobs. I think one of the reasons for that is because people can't imagine themselves doing this kind of work. Can you use a smartphone, make a PowerPoint, think on your feet, ever organize a night out to the movies with your friends that went well and nobody crashed their car to or from the event? Welcome to the 21st century's hottest career path. Are you able to charm the pants off women? Did you escape an abusive marriage? Have you ever hosted a toddler's birthday party at your home? Honey, I want you on my cybersecurity team. After reading the stories in this book, you will understand that what makes cybersecurity complicated is the complexity of human beings. So if you know how to deal with people, you can handle internet security. If you understand what makes people tick, not only will you be able to recognize a threat, you'll be one step ahead of your adversary. During my career as a cybersecurity executive at multinational corporations, a journalist for Wall Street Journal and later CNBC, and a professor at Georgetown University, I've met a lot of fascinating people. From the hackers who perpetrate malicious attacks to the security professionals who try to prevent these incidents from happening, and the alphabet soup of government agencies that do damage control. At the end of the day, they're all fathers, sons, mothers, sisters, and spouses. In other words, people just like us. Yes, the white hats cross paths with black hats and change alliances more frequently than you might expect, but they're driven by the same desires as the rest of us, even if sometimes it feels as if everyone in cybersecurity is allergic to the truth. As a professional, I was told a great many lies about the field I have grown to love so much. After becoming a journalist on the cybersecurity beat, I was told even more. Here are a few. Let me introduce you to the hacker community. This lie is usually delivered with a wink and a nod from someone who thinks they know every hacker on the planet. The truth of the matter is there is no hacker community. Sure, the guys who make a splash at the big annual conferences might say otherwise, but every country, every state, every faction, every identifying group has its own community of people who hack computers. Some of them are extremely conservative. Others are massively liberal. Some fall in between. Some wear suits and ties and work as lawyers during the day, while others look like everyday citizens and have great people skills as they pursue the idiosyncratic agendas. Some are good guys who got fed up with low pay and boring duties and became criminals. Some are criminals who ended up being good guys. Many start and end their careers on either end of that spectrum. Some, including many you'll meet in this book, are extremely proficient hackers who have no time or inclination to identify with any community at all. As a journalist, I was astonished at the number of people who came out of the woodwork to offer me exclusive access to the hacker community. I couldn't help but notice that the members of the source's hacker community were often people just like him or her. My point is there are many different types of people working in this field, and I can guarantee you that a lot of them are exactly like you. Here's another lie. He's a luminary in the cybersecurity field. He's probably not. Fame and luminescence don't typically intersect in this field. The people I've met who are actual geniuses aren't famous, and most of them don't have social media profiles. They tend not to pontificate on areas outside their expertise. The people who are constantly headlining conferences and who are so often offered up to me for interviews have less insight than those who stay underground. Anything a high-profile hacker is willing to share typically carries with it a massive and crystal clear agenda that I've learned to spot from a mile away. Even if a conversation is off the record, the intel coming from a top government official or other marquee corporate cybersecurity name carries little novel information. The only people who have illuminated the way for me in this world, and in this book, have been genuine practitioners who never held a C-level title. You've never heard of them, and because I've changed their names to protect their privacy, you probably never will. They are luminaries not because of the degrees they've collected or the events they've headlined, but because they carry a lantern that guides the path for others.
These types of people typically don't have a public relations team. One of my favorite lies, he doesn't know what he's talking about. This one is usually delivered by someone who asserts that he or she knows the cybersecurity field better than anyone else. These people will brag that they know what it's like to be a hacker and can do things that no one else in the room can do. I'm always wary of those who try to establish their bona fides by discrediting the expertise of other cybersecurity professionals. The depth and breadth of this field is so vast that anyone who works in it is an expert at some part of it. And I have yet to meet someone who is an expert at all of it, not even close. Every view of an incident is informed by the reviewer, what he sees, what her level of expertise is, and that changes over time. It's like asking someone who lives in the plaza to describe Manhattan. The book is Kingdom of Lies by Kate Fazzini. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
To believe that a man who single
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. We've been talking about Indigenous Peoples Day. We've been talking about what's going on in Syria, the betrayal of the Kurds and the Christians by Donald Trump, the slaughter of same, the bizarre contortions that some of Trump's defenders are having to go through as a consequence of this, what this might mean for other American allies, such as South Korea, which is confronting Kim in the north, that Trump has all but shined his shoes, to Taiwan, where Trump, invited Xi to his resort at Mar-a-Lago and all. The whole story. What's going to happen with these things? I'd like to expand the conversation into how Trump does this. How did this guy become president? And how does he hang on to enough people that he can hold a rally in Minneapolis, a blue town in a relatively blue state, and pull 20,000 people who hoop and holler when he screams obscenities and basically calls for the if not the death, certainly the violent attacks against his political enemies, against the media, things like that. An expert on this topic is Stephen Hassan. Stephen is the author of the best-selling book, Combating Cult Mind Control. He's an expert on undue influence, brainwashing, and unethical hypnosis. His most recent book is called The Cult of Trump. His website, freedomofmind.com. You can tweet him at cultexpert. Stephen, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on, Tom.
I really appreciate your being here with us and your having written this book. There was an interesting article this morning on a couple of different websites that was suggesting that if you view Trump as an old-fashioned middle school bully, that the most effective way to confront a bully is not to either A, bully them back or try to pick a fight with them because they'll always outdo you. They're professionals at it. And it's not to give in to them because then they get what they want, but it's rather to ridicule them in the context of appropriate behavior. I can't believe you're behaving like such a child, that kind of thing. But that doesn't take into account the cult-like aspect of Trump's followers and the cult leader-like aspect of his behavior.
Can you riff on that a little bit? Tell us what that is, how it comes about, and then let's get into what we can do about it.
Well, the most important thing with dealing with bullies is to stand up for the person they're bullying and to empower them and not just dial out while abuse is taking place. That's and I know you're an ex-psychotherapist. I'm a trained mental health professional. If I'm going to cut to the chase, I want to say to your listeners that we're living in a very unique time in the human species where our technology and our understanding of the human mind and how to influence it for the good or for the bad has never been higher. And that, unfortunately, people who want power, money, and sex, those are the three universals with destructive cult leaders, are using that knowledge to deceive, manipulate, and indoctrinate true believers to recruit and indoctrinate other people into their closed systems of destructive culthood. And when I started this book, I knew that he fit the stereotypical profile of most destructive cult leaders, that one of malignant narcissism. So it's more than just narcissism, but it's the sociopathic elements as well, the above the law and of course pathological lying and the sadism and the shaming, etc. But what I came to understand is that there were real authoritarian groups, some of them very wealthy, some of them state actors like Russia, that were using people who were already under their sway and coordinating them in together to put someone into power that was going to undermine confidence in our leadership, in our institutions. I learned about a very important concept, Tom, called fourth generation warfare, which is a psychological operations type term that's specifically oriented to delegitimizing science and facts and delegitimizing leaders and institutions. And that's a big facet of creating confusion and disorientation and hopelessness with a lot of people, where they're dialing out rather than realizing, hey, I want to understand how the mind works, how it can be manipulated, and how we can support our democracy and make it healthy again. And rescue our loved ones and friends who've been taken in.
Yeah, there are some people who suggest that there are parallels. In fact, there's a widely circulated piece, by a Hitler expert, suggesting that there are these 20 parallels between the rise of Hitler and the rise of Trump. I lived in Germany for a year. I knew some Germans, elderly Germans, who still thought that Hitler's biggest mistake was invading Russia, period, full stop. As well as a lot of Germans who were horrified by Hitler. But the Hitler cult is still alive and well in Germany. It's small, but it's still there.
And here, unfortunately.
Yes,
But I want to comment that Edward Bernays, who was a nephew of Freud, who did the first presidential campaign and was hired to teach women to smoke cigarettes by the tobacco industry, turned down Goebbels' offer of a job to help Hitler. But his 1928 book, Propaganda, was a guide that Goebbels used for the entire Nazi propaganda.
Amazing.
campaign.
I mean, he was the guy who advised Woodrow Wilson as to how to convince Americans that we should jump into World War I, too.
Yes.
That was his big beginning, as I recall.
And Hitler studied hypnosis, and he spent hours and hours in front of a mirror getting his gesticulations as effective as possible.
Right, I've read those histories. But the question where I was going with that question, Stephen, was to what extent was Hitler purely a cult leader as opposed to a political leader? To what extent is Trump purely a cult leader? I mean, are the parallels between the two, or between those two and dozens of other people in similar positions, even if they're like Jim Jones characters? Is what they have in common cult-like stuff, or is what they have in common political-like stuff? And you talked about the diminishment of science. I mean, Hitler used that with his racial theory stuff, that was widely disseminated in the early years of the Nazi era that contradicted a lot of good science. But anyhow, back to you.
So my take, Tom, is that there are the stereotypical profile, but then you can have someone who's got a religious cult or a political cult, a therapy cult, a multi-level marketing cult, be a pimp, a trafficker. In other words, people who are controlling want power. And then the question is, some people want world power and they want to take over the world, like my former cult leader, Sun Myung Moon, or a Hitler. And other people are satisfied with dominating their husband, wife, or some individual, or CEO wants to control their entire organization. But for me, the key point is on the influence continuum, that there are ethical guidelines like informed consent on the ethical side and lies by omission, distortion, or outright lying on the unethical side. And you can go down the entire paradigm that's on my website and in my books and tell very quickly who's a destructive authoritarian force that's trying to harm people for their personal gain.
So would you suggest that the authoritarianism, I mean, there's that book, The Authoritarians, that inspired John Dean to write his book, Conservatives Without Conscience. Both brilliant analysis of the authoritarian personality, both the authoritarian leader and the authoritarian follower. Are you suggesting that and cult leaders and cult followers are essentially one and the same? We're just using different language to describe the same thing?
So I actually believe that if you're raised in a childhood family system where you're not encouraged to think for yourself, but you're told to be obedient, where you're corporally punished, which has been well researched, is very traumatic for young children. If you're in that kind of childhood upbringing, it's going to be more familiar to be with somebody who continues to behave that way. I wasn't raised that way, and yet I was deceived and indoctrinated into an authoritarian, theocratic, fascist cult group. So my argument is actually they're very intelligent, educated people from good homes that have secure attachment, but they can be deceived and hypnotized and indoctrinated into totalistic authoritarian groups.
So this leads us, we have a little more than a minute and a half before we're going to hit a hard break here. This leads to the question, what do we do about it? How do we best combat Trump as a cult leader?
So the reason I wrote this book is to educate everyone about what is the whole technology of mind control about, how to protect yourself, how to dialogue with people who have been indoctrinated in cults. For example, the worst thing you can do is say you're an idiot or stupid, or why can't you look at the facts, or you're brainwashed. That's what not to say.
That just makes them dig in.
It makes them defensive and shut down, and they feel persecuted. Whereas if you say, hey, you're an intelligent, educated person, I value you, help me understand, before you ever heard of Trump, how did you get to this point today? Like, walk me through the steps and to unpack the actual influences. Oh, I was listening to Rush Limbaugh radio. I was watching Fox News. I was listening to my pastor, and he said that he had a revelation from God that God wants to have final days and wants to influence the United States government. In other words, it's an engagement process with.
So now you've understood where this. Forgive my interrupting. We have 30 seconds. You've understood where this person came from. How do you deprogram them?
So part of it is educating them about brainwashing. I was educated about Chinese communist brainwashing programs of Mao. Mm-hmm. So that's a body of knowledge to discuss with them. To point parallels out to other groups that the person would agree with are destructive mind control cults, and then to back your way into asking questions in a curious way with respect. And people do come to the realization that they've been lied to.
That's fascinating. I'll try that the next time a Trump supporter calls me. That's fascinating. Stephen Hassan, I'm looking forward to reading your book. We just got it. I've read only the first the introduction, the first chapter. Freedomofmind.com.
Maybe we'll have another chat.
Thank you. And the book is The Cult of Trump. Yes, I look forward to that. Thank you, Stephen.
Is the Thom Hartmann program.
It's 18 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls in just a moment. And welcome back. Bob in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Hey, Bob, what's on your mind today?
Well, hello, Tom.
Hey, Bob.
As usual, as the conversation goes on, it kind of fragments my first point I was thinking of, but that's the way it goes in the conversation, isn't it?
Bob?
Yes.
Yeah, you faded out there. Were you about to say hemp?
No.
Okay.
I was saying my original point kind of fragmented a little bit because the conversation has just gone on, but it kind of ties in. I would wonder what Greta thinks.
Greta Thunberg or Greta Van Susteren?
The former, the young lady, yes,
right.
Because I mean the conversation. Columbus Day is just a date. It's a date when the explorer landed over here. That's it.
Yeah.
History speaks for itself. We've come around to understand what it is. I think the earlier caller you had from the Muskogee Creek tribe really said the essence of what I'm trying to say better than I could, really.
The Columbus essentially brought white supremacy to this continent?
Well, yeah, if we don't get our act together pretty soon and just essentially disregard people like Trump in the first place so that they can't become president, the office of the presidency isn't going to mean much when it's not a dignified office.
Well, I think one of two things, Bob, if I could interrupt you for just a second, and
sure,
feel free to respond to this. I think the Trump presidency is going to produce one of two outcomes with regard to future presidents. Either future presidents are going to learn from him and they're going to do what he did, only they're going to do it smart and wily and methodical, and we're going to end up becoming a Mussolini, Italy-style fascist state, or there's going to be such a backlash to him, such revulsion among the electorate and within the Republican Party that we're going to start getting a whole lot more careful about how we vet people in primary races and things like that. And never again will we see a Trump. It's going to go one of those two directions, and I can't predict which way it's going to go. Back to you, Bob.
It's hard to make predictions. We would certainly hope for the latter. The situation is, you were describing what somebody, you had read a book by somebody you mentioned earlier, and he was saying there's three ways we can deal with this situation.
Yeah, that was Jack Davis, and his book was Columbus and Other Cannibals. Professor Jack Davis. He's now deceased, but brilliant.
I think there's a fourth way, and that is that they join us, and we have democracy and a greener earth.
Right. Well, the Native Americans tried that. On many occasions, they welcomed Europeans and said, hey, join our society, or here's how we live. Would you like this? Jefferson writes in his diaries at some length, his father, took him to visit 20, 30 different tribal communities when he was mapping Virginia. And he was, so admiring of these people and, wrote about, learning from them and all that sort of thing. But ultimately, he also participated in the massive genocide of Native Americans when he became president, with the whole, the Louisiana Purchase and moving west. It's really a tragedy what has happened in this country. We need to clean it up. 22 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers.
America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Welcome back. We've been talking about, Trump destroying the whole America First thing, Trump destroying our strategic alliances, Trump as a cult leader, how best to deprogram our friends and neighbors who are devotees of the Trump cult. How do you speak to these people? This question, what was the starting point for you? How did you get here? Jen Senko, Senko, who wrote The Brainwashing of My Dad? And produced it and performs in it. I mean, it's a video. I think it's available on Netflix right now. It certainly probably lives on YouTube. If you have anybody in your family who is a member of the Trump cult, and I think we need to start calling it that, by the way. If you have anybody who's a member of the Trump cult, get that movie, The Brainwashing of My Dad by Jen Senko, and who has been on this program a few times. The movie came out several years ago. It is just as good as it ever was. And it's basically about how Fox News turned her father from a loving, benevolent, smart, thoughtful guy. He started watching Fox News when he retired and was just sitting at home watching the TV, and became this irascible, cranky, paranoid, angry, difficult to be around. Forget politics. I'm talking just a complete personality change that her father experienced as a result of essentially, watching billionaire Rupert Murdoch's television networks, Trump TV, Fox News, and believing it, absorbing it, and making it a part of his own identity, and it altered who he was as a person. And then you watch the was it a Showtime or HBO? It's maybe it's Amazon. I'm not sure how we watched. I think is it Showtime. That's that 5 or 6 part special on Roger Ailes. Do you remember the title of that, Sean or Nate? Either one of you? It was HBO. Yeah. But in any case, I think it's called The Loudest Voice in the Room, as I recall. But what you see is that Roger Ailes himself was paranoid. I wrote a book called Walking Your Blues Away, in which I revealed for the first time, I believe, why Sigmund Freud stopped using hypnosis, which was very effective for him as a therapeutic technique, why he stopped using that in 1898. And it's a fascinating story, and I'll tell it on the air again one of these days. But the point is that the times changed, and Freud went back to, or started this whole talk therapy thing, and Freud himself became more and more bitter and insular, as is the case of many people who go through classic Freudian therapy. Sometimes it works, but very often it turns people basically into Freud. And I think that Roger Ailes did the same thing. He's turning people into Roger Ailes, and when you watch that documentary, you see that this guy was paranoid.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
I mean, he built a survivalist bomb shelter at his home. He was getting ready for the end of the world kind of thing. We'll be back with you folks. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment by yours truly. This is from Chapter 1, The Unholy Alliance of Racism, Genocide, and Guns. In Isaiah 14:21, the Lord tells Isaiah, "Prepare for his sons a place of slaughter because of the iniquity of their fathers." It's a variation on the old story of karma and seems in a very real way to be playing out today in the United States. America is facing an epidemic. Public health officials use that word of gun-related suicides, accidents, and even homicides and police killings. That epidemic has grown worse in the past decade, largely because the number of guns in America has increased, in large part because of the racial fears of white men who have bought guns in record numbers for 8 years during the time in office of America's first black president.
A landmark 1999 study from researchers Franklin Zimmerman and Gordon Hawkins showed that the main correlation, far surpassing mental illness, socioeconomic status, or race, that could be defined as causal in predicting the rates of gun deaths is a simple number: the number of guns distributed among society. In the 30 years since that study, Zimmerman and Hawkins' results have been replicated and reanalyzed dozens of times. As the American Academy of Pediatrics said in a release published in AAAS's Science magazine, quote, new research shows dramatic differences in the number of children hospitalized and killed each year in the U.S. from firearm-related injuries based on their state's gun legislation, even after adjusting for poverty, unemployment, and education rates. It found twice as many pediatric firearm deaths in states with the most lenient gun regulations compared to states where gun laws are strictest, end quote. They added that this is a critical issue for children, quoting Stephanie Cho, MD, the lead author of the abstract, quote, firearm-related injuries are the second leading cause of death among children in the United States, but we found a clear discrepancy in where those deaths happen that corresponds with the strengths of states' firearm legislation. In states with lenient laws, children die at alarmingly greater rates, end quote. And unsurprisingly, America not only has unusually lenient gun laws, but also has more guns in civilian hands than any other country in the world. America has a bit more than 4% of the world's population, but holds almost 50% of all the guns in civilian hands worldwide, more than 390 million guns. And the more guns a society has, the more gun deaths it will experience. The NRA and their army of lobbyists have been quite successful in making this happen. During Obama's presidency, there was a steady and hysterical drumbeat of articles, emails, and political proclamations by so-called pro-gun politicians and think tanks, suggesting that Obama was preparing to take away everyone's guns at any minute. There was even a subtext embraced by the hard right that he wasn't going to stop there. After disarming white Americans, these folks said, Obama was going to intern them in otherwise unused FEMA camps. Flipped-out gun owners were repeatedly arrested during the Obama years trying to break into retired or temporarily vacant military facilities and toxic waste sites, looking for evidence to prove that Obama was, in fact, preparing the modern-day version of the World War II-era Japanese internment camps. White supremacy was the founding notion of this nation. White Europeans thought themselves so superior to the human beings they met here in 1492 that Columbus himself became the first North American slaver, shipping Taino Indians back to Spain as slaves to the royal family. A slave is as good as gold, Columbus wrote for the king and queen. Europeans in the Americas then stepped up that game into a hemisphere-wide campaign of racial genocide, pulling off the largest multi-generational mass murder in the history of the world. In the midst of that effort, they also created the legal mechanisms necessary to define and legally regulate slavery, and even built those systems into America's founding document, the Constitution. America was birthed in slavery and genocide, and both needed guns. It was the superior weaponry of guns that gave the European settlers a massive advantage over the bow and arrow-equipped Native Americans, and it was the raw power of widespread white ownership of guns in the South that propped up the institution of slavery for hundreds of years. Without guns, neither would have been possible, or at least neither would have been as easy as they were to pull off. And now, after centuries of guns being used to kill off and keep down people of color in America, those same guns are creating a terrifying epidemic of gun-facilitated violence, from public schools to private homes and public concerts. It's enough to make one think that Isaiah was onto something. Chapter 2, The Sanitized History of America. The United States' expansion and conquest in the late 18th century through the 19th century and into the 20th century is a history written by white men, inked in the blood of Native Americans, and built on the broken and bloody backs of enslaved people brought here from Africa. From 1791, when the Bill of Rights went into effect, until the end of the Civil War, the Second Amendment protected the rights only of white men to own guns. This is simply because until the ratification of the 14th Amendment, states determined who was recognized as a person protected under the Constitution. Initially, in most states, that meant that white men who owned land and paid taxes were the only people considered full citizens under the Constitution. In the South, white men with guns formed slave patrols to control slaves and formed posses to hunt escaped slaves.
The book, The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. We're talking about, wow, we've got all kinds of stuff, from impeachment to Trump's betrayal of the Kurds, his basically turning over northern Syria to Russia, what's going to happen when the Russian forces confront the Turkish forces. Sue Nethercutt, who publishes or edits our newsletter, brilliantly, I might add, and puts together our daily stack, tweeted that I had asked the question in the first hour. I said, I'm not sure who controls the nuclear arsenal that NATO has in Turkey. Turns out it's us, the United States, which is kind of weird given that Donald Trump appears to be willing to do whatever Erdogan tells him to do. That he took Turkey off the Muslim ban list back in the day when Erdogan threatened to take Trump off the Trump Towers. We don't know what Erdogan threatened Trump with this time or what was promised to him. You can build a new Trump Tower. It could be in Moscow. It could be you have a second one in Istanbul. I mean, he's thinking about what he's going to do after he gets kicked out of the White House. And perhaps he and the entire Trump crime family, this whole collection of grifters, Jared and Ivanka and Don Jr. and little Eric, when all of them move to Moscow or to some other country that ends with Stan, how they're going to maintain their business empire and hang on to what little cash they have. I mean, we'll see. Paul in Woodinville, Washington. Hey, Paul, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. I wanted to follow up, expound a little bit on some of what your guest was saying. It occurs to me.
The Trump of cult.
The cult of Trump. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, what's clear is that the Trump base has rejected the traditional Republican Party. I mean, Trump dispensed of 15 other very traditional Republicans. So what happens? So in other words, the Trump supporter, the Trump hardcore Trump supporter, they obviously hate their family, and let's say their family is the Hatfields. They hate their family, but that doesn't mean they're going to join the McCoys. In other words, just because that doesn't mean they're going to vote for the Democrats. And we've seen, and I think you have a guest on your show, people who have become white supremacists who became part of that. And maybe your guest was, I can't remember if you mentioned this, but
he was a Mooney.
Yeah, okay, because they had a lack in the family. So obviously, this is what I've been saying about the Republicans is they can never go back. After this, they can never go back. They can never pitch a traditional Republican thought in the general politic again because they've outright rejected it. So the hardcore Trump supporter has gone for this cult leader. They didn't go for the Democrats because obviously the Hatfields have been demonizing the McCoys, and so they have that demonization in their head as well. Now, your regular traditional Trump or Republican, I think they're just running scared because they're thinking they're not going to have a family because they also have demonization of the McCoys in their brain, but they don't believe in Trump, but they don't know what to believe in now.
Right.
And what I've seen, I think this Fox News has obviously demonized the Democrats, and I knew, and maybe other people have, I knew somebody who was 5 years ago in a religious cult, and she got out of it, and another friend of hers was getting out, and what was happening as the cult was breaking up, and it was over financial issues, the nuts and bolts, the hardcore, that's what it was started at, financial things, but then they all started turning on each other.
Yeah.
And that's how the thing fell apart, and I think that's what's going to start happening here.
Yeah, I think we're looking at something analogous to the end of the Whigs. And the question is what's going to come out of it and how's it going to go? One of my very dearest friends was a member of the Maharaji cult, the perfect 15-year-old perfect master back in the 70s. And he not only got out of that, but he was partners with Ted Patrick for a while, deprogramming people, became a psychotherapist, and then became a Hasidic Jew. Joined the Hasidic movement. And we once had this conversation. I said, haven't you kind of joined another cult? And he's like, yeah, but this is not a destructive one. This is one that is constructive of family and faith and religion and all those kind of things. And I've spent a lot of time with him and inside that group, and I have to agree with him. And in fact, if somebody put a gun to my head and said, you have to live a religious life, pick one, that's probably where I'd go. And so I think it's important that we draw that distinction between destructive cults and constructive cults, to the extent that the word cult can be a neutral word. It's and what's going to happen to these people who are Trump cult followers as opposed to the traditional Republicans? There's this other debate, Paul, inside the Democratic Party, which is if the Republican Party implodes, the old-fashioned Republicans basically had the quote conservative worldview was that women should be in their place, minorities should be in their place, and you know what I mean by those phrases, and that business and rich people should run the country and the government, and and they would use soft language for it, but that was basically that's been the Republican Party since the 1950s, really, up until about 3-4 years ago, and there are Democrats who share those opinions. I think Dan Lipinski, if I'm saying his name right, the guy in Chicago who consistently votes with the Republicans, and now he's got a primary challenger. But there are people in the Democratic Party who are saying, if the Democratic Party kind of purifies itself and becomes the party of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, or even some middle ground, the Pete Buttigieg party, there's going to be no place for those people, and that maybe the Democratic Party should be big tent, and we should welcome some of those people, and there should be anti-abortion Democrats, and there actually is. There's a pro-life Democrat movement within the Democratic Party, and I'm not quite I had a pretty strong opinion prior to Trump that would be a mistake. But I'm wondering, or is the Republican Party going to reconstitute itself or reincarnate itself as the old Republican Party, and reject the Trump cultists? And
those kinds of Republicans that you were talking about, Tom, really need to get a backbone. They need to get I'm talking about the traditional ones that you were kind of describing.
Right.
They need to get a backbone and grow a spine, so to speak, because they all basically went with Trump, and they're still signing on to the Trump train because I think they're terrified that there's no place else to go.
I think they're going to unify around Mitt Romney. And I think that Romney is trying to position himself as when Trump goes down in flames and nobody wants Pence, I'll ride in as the savior. I was thinking as recently as 3 weeks ago that Mitt Romney was setting himself up for 2024. I'm now thinking he's setting himself up for 2020.
Oh, I thought that as soon as he ran for the Senate, Mitt Romney does not need to be a senator. He doesn't need that. He needed a platform to run for president, and I think that he's gambling that the traditional Republicans will come to his side. But again, I say once Trump dispensed of them, they've all been they just had this ignominious end. It was all just
well. And the other question is, what's going to happen when Trump figures out that Mitt Romney's coming for him for 2020? Is Trump going to try to preemptively take down Romney, or is he going to pave the way in the hopes that Romney will be the guy who actually can win and might win the White House, and then might pardon Trump
himself.
No, the problem for Romney, Tom, is that the Trump cultists won't go from it.
I know that.
Need that part.
I know that.
They need that part of the party. That's where the fractionalization comes in. Is they need.
But see, the thing about the Trump cultists, Paul, is that what's holding them together is Fox News and right-wing hate radio, and the cracks are starting to show over at Fox News, and Lachlan Murdoch, I think, is starting to get uncomfortable with the whole situation. So, if Fox News turns its back on Trump, as they seem to have started to do this weekend, frankly, from what I'm reading, will that pave the way for Mitt Romney? And if so, would he pardon Trump?
Also, right-wing hate radio, of course, inside radio, people know that they are in such incredible debt that maybe they'll just collapse, and that whole format will just disappear.
Yeah, it's possible. I haven't looked at ratings in quite a while. But it would be fascinating to take a look at over a 5-year period.
It was Bain Capital that bailed out, Clear Channel and now iHeart.
No, they didn't bail out Clear Channel. They sucked it dry, killed it off, and threw it into bankruptcy, and then it reincarnated as iHeart Radio. And Mitt Romney made millions off that, probably hundreds of millions of dollars off that deal. He's probably a billionaire.
Right, they refinanced the debt, but the debt's still there.
Oh yeah, it was a debt of over $1 billion.
So it's $20 billion.
20 billion. Oh, whoa. Okay.
And the two of them together, $25 billion. Cumulus was not quite as bad off, but
yeah.
Everybody. I mean, I can't see how that can be sustainable, and they just write that off because that's just been what you're talking about. So, Thanks, Tom. I appreciate the time.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. It raises a whole lot of fascinating questions. This conversation that Paul and I just had, and frankly, I don't think there's any clear answers to any of them. But I think it's really important that we understand that these are the possible, here are the forks in the road, and here are some of the possible destinations at the end of those forks, and here's how some of them start.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
It's 46 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls in just a moment. Stick around. And welcome back. David in Mendocino. Hey, David, thanks for calling. Mendocino, California. What's up?
Hi, Tom. My understanding is that tomorrow's Democratic primary debate is not going to be broadcast on our airways. You're going to need a computer with an internet connection or a subscription to CNN to watch it.
I thought it was going to be carried on CNN on the internet. I mean, on cable TV. Now, cable TV is not broadcast over the airways, so you're right about that.
I have Dish Network, and I don't have CNN.
Seriously?
Seriously, yeah. No, it depends on which package you have.
Right. Yeah, I understand. I have. We have Sling, which is owned by DirecTV, and we don't have Fox because you have to pay extra for that. That's part of a news package that I don't want. So I get CNN and MSNBC, but I don't get Fox.
Well, I really think this is the Democratic National Committee's idea of blundering into another loss in 2020. If they can't understand how to get the word out, they're crazy. These debates are important.
Yeah, I think they are too. I'm not deep enough in the weeds of Democratic or political consultancy to know what the impact would be of having it on ABC, CBS, NBC versus CNN. I'm guessing what's going to happen is that whatever comes out of this debate, and tragically, knowing how our news industry works right now, it won't be the issues of substance or the or the thoughtful responses. It's going to be the zingers and the who kicked Joe Biden in the shins and who made Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders look bad, or did Tulsi Gabbard really, show up, or did she get revenge? Or all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's, revenge is the wrong word. Did she expose what she is saying is the Democratic Party's rigging the primaries? It's all going to be kind of sports stuff, inside baseball, and that will be reported on the big television networks. but I don't think
I think eventually it'll be reported. But I mean, we're leaving out an awful lot of people.
Yeah.
That don't have money or internet connection.
Well, CNN in the past has allowed people who are not subscribers to CNN to watch CNN.com live on the internet during events that they thought were of great consequence. I would be surprised if they required you to have a CNN subscription to watch the debates. Now, like I said, I'd be surprised, but it may well be the case.
The lower cost internet
I see.
on Dish,
right.
And so I'm limited to like 5 gigs, and I forget how slow it is, but when it's busy out there, I can't download a video.
Well, you might want to go to CNN.com and see if they're going to offer a purely audio stream, because an audio stream uses very, very little bandwidth. I mean, you wouldn't even use a couple of megabytes for an entire hour. So
I don't believe that's true. I know I've wanted to listen to talk radio up in Chicago,
right?
And and they told me it would use the same number of gigs as if I was watching something.
No, that's not true. That's not true.
Not true. Okay.
No, it's absolutely not true. I mean, our program's available on the internet, both as radio and as television. And the TV stream is a couple of megabits wide, and the radio stream is just a few kilobytes wide. Kilobytes are thousands, megabytes are millions. So no, that's audio will save you the bandwidth. Thank you, David. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. We really do appreciate it. It's all over at ThomHartmann.com. Welcome back. Has America, has our reputation around the world been irreparably destroyed by Donald Trump? Has the Republican Party been irreparably harmed by Donald Trump? Is it going to go the way of the Whigs and be replaced by something new? Is it going to recover, and if so, how? Where does all this go? And by the way, this is Indigenous Peoples Day. In the first hour, I was reading from Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, the chapter about Columbus as a rapist and a murderer and a slaver, and we need to remember this. And of course, in the beginning of this hour, Stephen Hassan was on talking about the cult of Trump. And the title of his new book, the subhead, A Leading Cult Expert, explains how the president uses mind control. Patrick in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Hey, Patrick, what's on your mind today? Patrick, watching YouTube in Elizabeth? Okay. Patrick, I'm going to put you on hold, and we'll have Joyce check you out. Patrick's on line 5, Joyce. Charles in Portland, Oregon. Hey, Charles, what's up?
Tom, hey, how you doing? Portland, Oregon, and Tom Dwyer Automotive saying hi. Listen to X-Ray FM.
Oh, cool. Thank you. And
I wanted
tip
to
of the
tell you
hat to Tom Dwyer Automotive. He's the best guy in town to take your car to.
Well, and longtime fan, sorry we missed you on your latest Portland appearance, but we caught the one before that with Naomi. So. Yeah. Hey, I wanted to tell you about an abomination happening in radio that you may not be aware of. Up on the upper end of the AM dial in the 1300s, where nobody ever listens to anything, the Koch brothers have started a new network. The tagline for it is God and Country, but it's an explicit fusion of religion and politics funded by the Koch brothers. As far as I can tell, they're the only sponsors. They have, when they go to their commercial breaks, there's a running thing about how Koch brothers, this is what we do for you. Koch, we make that. And trying to
you mean Koch Industries?
Nice and Koch Industries, yes.
Huh.
Then they the only other sponsor is their radio marketing arm that tries to get advertisers for their station, but it's a total propaganda piece, just pumping, and I mean the scariest, nastiest, most brutal, stripped down version of propaganda, politics, and religion that you can possibly imagine.
Fascinating. I'll have to dig into that. I was unaware of that. Charles, thanks for the heads up on that. We'll look into it. Michael in New York City. Hey, Michael, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, how you doing?
Good.
First off, this idea of GOPs and their resistance to the impeachment inquiry, calling it a kangaroo court.
Right.
Democrats are not doing it as a kangaroo court. If it's a kangaroo court, it's by those Republicans. I speak of Jim Jordan, Matt Gaetz, and all these other Trump GOPs, the ones that keep hopping around, ducking and dodging the truth, the facts, and ducking and dodging accountability. They're the ones that are treating it as a kangaroo court.
They're the kangaroos. Yeah, we know the phrase kangaroo court goes back to the 18th or 19th century, but nobody's quite sure where it started. Clearly post-discovery of Australia, but I'd say the kangaroo court was one of those guys. You remember Benghazi? How long they stretched that thing out, and Hillary's emails? I mean, those took years. Millions and millions of dollars. Literally, not a single indictment, not one. And Robert Mueller's already indicted 30 some odd people. Gotten a whole bunch of convictions.
And you were just reading my mind, because I have the answer as to how do we deal with these Republicans, these Trump GOPs. And they're the ones that kept saying, they went after Bill Clinton and tried to go after Hillary Clinton, that their activities, the Monica Gate, the emails, the Benghazi have put this nation security at risk, and we must look out for the American people, and which at the same time now, they have legitimized each and every bit of Trump's crimes, actions, audio, video, tweets, the rhetoric, and Trump's actions has resulted in hundreds, maybe even thousands of people getting hurt and or killed. But meanwhile,
and dying. I mean, our entire next hour is going to be about. We're going to continue these conversations, obviously. But why does the Republican Party insist on letting people die to enhance the profits of the healthcare industry and for the ideology of Charles Koch, basically? Government shouldn't be involved in healthcare. Why are they aggressively working to destroy Medicare, for example, by promoting Medicare Advantage and expanding Medicare Advantage, which is privatized Medicare? Why? We know. I mean, we know why they're trying to privatize Medicare. They don't want Medicare for all. But all those things are on the table, Michael. I think they're absolutely on the table, and these are the issues of our day. Actually, this is the essential stuff. I mean, you've boiled it down, And how much longer are we willing to tolerate this kind of behavior? Cult leader-like behavior, treasonous, traitorous behavior coming out of the White House, of all places. I mean, the founders are rolling over in their graves. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment by yours truly. This is from Chapter 1, The Unholy Alliance of Racism, Genocide, and Guns. In Isaiah 14:21, the Lord tells Isaiah, "Prepare for his sons a place of slaughter because of the iniquity of their fathers." It's a variation on the old story of karma and seems in a very real way to be playing out today in the United States. America is facing an epidemic. Public health officials use that word of gun-related suicides, accidents, and even homicides and police killings. That epidemic has grown worse in the past decade, largely because the number of guns in America has increased, in large part because of the racial fears of white men who have bought guns in record numbers for 8 years during the time in office of America's first black president. A landmark 1999 study from researchers Franklin Zimmering and Gordon Hawkins showed that the main correlation, far surpassing mental illness, socioeconomic status, or race, that could be defined as causal in predicting the rates of gun deaths is a simple number: the number of guns distributed among society. In the 30 years since that study, Zimmering and Hawkins' results have been replicated and reanalyzed dozens of times. As the American Academy of Pediatrics said in a release published in AAAS's Science magazine, quote, "New research shows dramatic differences in the number of children hospitalized and killed each year in the U.S. from firearm-related injuries based on their state's gun legislation, even after adjusting for poverty, unemployment, and education rates. It found twice as many pediatric firearm deaths in states with the most lenient gun regulations compared to states where gun laws are strictest," end quote. They added that this is a critical issue for children, quoting Stephanie Cho, MD, the lead author of the abstract, quote, "Firearm-related injuries are the second leading cause of death among children in the United States. But we found a clear discrepancy in where those deaths happen that corresponds with the strengths of states' firearm legislation. In states with lenient laws, children die at alarmingly greater rates," end quote. And unsurprisingly, America not only has unusually lenient gun laws, but also has more guns in civilian hands than any other country in the world. America has a bit more than 4% of the world's population, but holds almost 50% of all the guns in civilian hands worldwide, more than 390 million guns. And the more guns a society has, the more gun deaths it will experience. The NRA and their army of lobbyists have been quite successful in making this happen. During Obama's presidency, there was a steady and hysterical drumbeat of articles, emails, and political proclamations by so-called pro-gun politicians and think tanks, suggesting that Obama was preparing to take away everyone's guns at any minute. There was even a subtext embraced by the hard right that he wasn't going to stop there. After disarming white Americans, these folks said, Obama was going to intern them in otherwise unused FEMA camps. Flipped-out gun owners were repeatedly arrested during the Obama years trying to break into retired or temporarily vacant military facilities and toxic waste sites, looking for evidence to prove that Obama was, in fact, preparing the modern-day version of the World War II-era Japanese internment camps. White supremacy was the founding notion of this nation. White Europeans thought themselves so superior to the human beings they met here in 1492 that Columbus himself became the first North American slaver, shipping Taino Indians back to Spain as slaves to the royal family. "A slave is as good as gold," Columbus wrote for the king and queen. Europeans in the Americas then stepped up that game into a hemisphere-wide campaign of racial genocide, pulling off the largest multi-generational mass murder in the history of the world. In the midst of that effort, they also created the legal mechanisms necessary to define and legally regulate slavery, and even built those systems into America's founding document, the Constitution. America was birthed in slavery and genocide, and both needed guns. It was the superior weaponry of guns that gave the European settlers a massive advantage over the bow and arrow-equipped Native Americans, and it was the raw power of widespread white ownership of guns in the South that propped up the institution of slavery for hundreds of years. Without guns, neither would have been possible, or at least neither would have been as easy as they were to pull off. And now, after centuries of guns being used to kill off and keep down people of color in America, those same guns are creating a terrifying epidemic of gun-facilitated violence, from public schools to private homes and public concerts. It's enough to make one think that Isaiah was onto something. Chapter 2, The Sanitized History of America. The United States' expansion and conquest in the late 18th century through the 19th century and into the 20th century is a history written by white men, inked in the blood of Native Americans, and built on the broken and bloody backs of enslaved people brought here from Africa. From 1791, when the Bill of Rights went into effect, until the end of the Civil War, the Second Amendment protected the rights only of white men to own guns. This is simply because until the ratification of the 14th Amendment, states determined who was recognized as a person protected under the Constitution. Initially, in most states, that meant that white men who owned land and paid taxes were the only people considered full citizens under the Constitution. In the South, white men with guns formed slave patrols to control slaves and formed posses to hunt escaped slaves. The book, The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment.
Want to connect with the show
Trump's decision to end protection.
The Thom Hartmann program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Tom. Here, my new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. When he was The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to our third hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. We have covered so much territory so far. We've been wondering why Trump is doing what he's doing in Syria. Is it because Erdogan has threatened him economically with his Trump Tower? Is it something that he was promised? Was it orders from his boss, Mr. Putin? We just don't know. But American soldiers are feeling betrayed. The Kurds are feeling betrayed. The Christians in that area who were fighting with the Kurds, the Syrian Democratic Force, was a combination of local indigenous Kurds and local indigenous Christians and some local indigenous Arab Syrians, fighting together against Assad and against ISIS. And now Trump has abandoned them, and so ISIS has. Now, the ISIS flag is once again flying in Syria. The ISIS fighters have been freed. The Kurds are being squeezed between Russian and Syrian troops coming up from the north and Turkish troops coming down from the south. When they meet, will that collision lead to World War III, or will it lead to a brand new detente between Turkey and Russia, which has been brewing for some time now? Turkey has bought advanced anti-missile systems from Russia over the objections of the rest of NATO. Turkey is a NATO country. We base nuclear weapons in Turkey. This is all getting very, very weird. Somebody called earlier and asked about the debate on CNN. In fact, his complaint was that he has a package with Dish or Direct TV. I think it was Dish TV. He said that you could buy these inexpensive packages where you get just a small number of channels, and he's got one that does not include CNN. And he was like, "How am I going to watch the debate?" And and he's got an online service provider, an internet service provider, with a 5 gig a month cap, and so he doesn't want to watch a video on his TV. So I just, this is from Time Magazine. This is where the debate, of course, is tomorrow night. And Wednesday, Congressman Pocan will be on with us for the hour. But other than that, we're basically going to devote the day Wednesday to my thoughts on the debate and your thoughts on the debate. So we're all looking forward to that.
But it will be on CNN, of course, and on CNN International, and streamed on CNN's homepage and the New York Times.com, nytimes.com homepage at no cost, and you don't have to be a subscriber. In addition, the debate will be available on the CNN app, on the New York Times app, on the CNN Go apps, on Apple TV, on Roku, on Amazon Fire, on Chromecast, on Android TV. It'll be carried on Sirius XM on channels 116 and 454 and 795. I didn't realize their channels went that high, but anyhow, it'll be on Sirius XM. It'll be on the Westwood One radio network, and also NPR is going to carry it. So, for those of you who don't want to spend a penny on the internet or cable TV watching it, you can listen to it on NPR and a lot of the Westwood radio stations. I wanted to get into healthcare in this hour as well. I mean, taking a step back from the craziness going on with Trump and what's going on, this tragic betrayal of American values and American allies in Syria. We had a Green Beret go to the press and say, "We are ashamed." But beyond that, Trump is also betraying Americans and allowing Americans to die. And it's not just Trump. It's Trump and the entire Republican Party. And I say this without hyperbole. This is not an exaggeration. I refer you to a piece from MSN, Microsoft Network, MSN.com. The headline, "The Medicaid Experiment in Arkansas. Thousands lost coverage, few gained jobs." What happened was in Arkansas, Governor Asa Hutchinson, the Republican, they have a Republican-controlled legislature as well. They passed this law that said that if you're on Medicaid, now Medicaid is health care for basically low-income people. There's two kinds of Medicaid. There is the basic Medicaid, which is typically for people who make up to $2,000 or $3,000 a year. I mean, truly destitute people qualify for Medicaid in pretty much all the states. And then there's the Medicaid expansion that came along with Obamacare, which is for people who make between $2,000 or $3,000 and up to between $15,000 and $18,000, depending on the state. Who are working but are so poor that they can't afford health insurance and their job doesn't provide it. And Arkansas, I don't recall if they had actually expanded Medicaid or not. I think not. I think this is for the very low income. But in any case, what Arkansas did is they passed this law that said that if you are on Medicaid, you must every 3 months prove to the state that you are working at least 80 hours a month. And that if you're not working 80 hours a month, you are doing 80 hours a month of community service through an accredited agency. Now, the way you prove this to the state is you log on to a state website, create an account for yourself, and then upload proof that you have done these things. And the problem is that the state website doesn't work particularly well. It's often down for maintenance. And what this does is it causes people to just get kicked off Medicaid, number one. And number two, a lot of people are so disabled that they can neither work nor do the 80 hours a week of community service, if they could even find the opportunity to do it, particularly in rural areas. And so, they're really screwed. The article, this is by Arian Campo Flores and Stephanie Armour, starts out with a story. With the help of Medicaid, Stanley Ellis got 2 hip replacement surgeries and other care to treat a condition that causes bone tissue to die. But earlier this year, after an emergency ambulance trip to a hospital here for splitting pain in his shoulder and head, a nurse delivered upsetting news. He had lost his coverage due to this new state work requirement rule. Mr. Ellis, a 42-year-old former diesel mechanic who thought he was exempt from the requirement because he's legally disabled, said, "I was hurting so bad I couldn't even react." And then the article goes on to point out Mr. Ellis is one of more than 18,000 people. Now just imagine how many families are impacted by that. That's probably a couple 100,000 families. And this is just in Arkansas. And other red states want to do this. Arkansas was the experiment. They were going to prove that it works, right? Mr. Ellis is one of more than 18,000 people who were cut from Medicaid rolls after Arkansas embarked on a closely watched experiment in June of last year when it became the only state to fully implement a work requirement for program recipients. And they say the outcome in Arkansas could help shape the future of Medicaid, which now covers, by the way, 1 in 7 American adults. That's how deep poverty is in the United States. 1 in 7 American adults now gets their health care paid for via Medicaid, which is only available to basically people in the bottom half of what is considered poverty in the United States. Asa Hutchinson, as I mentioned, the Republican governor, said this was just a wonderful thing. The state spent $26 million, not healing people, not paying for hospital bills, but putting this program into place. And then they spent an additional $24 million between June of 2017 and December 2018. They say that the whole point of the program is to get people into jobs, but they never set up any mechanism to measure how many people got jobs. Literally, I mean, here's the argument. The state still doesn't know how many recipients gained employment as a result of the work requirement because it never set up a system to track whether people subject to it had found jobs. And then they go through, it's called Arkansas Works is the name of the program, and most of the recipients were already working. But a large number of them can't get on because the website's so hard to, here again from the article, the online portal to submit activity hours was difficult to navigate. Some beneficiaries don't have computers or a way to report the information online. Those needing assistance could call a helpline, but the helpline, you sit on hold for hours at a time. In February, more than 80% of the Arkansas work enrollees required to report activities to the state didn't do so. And as a result of that, 18,164 people were kicked off Medicaid. And, as far as anybody can tell, if anybody got a job out of this thing, there's who knows, right? So the flip side of this is what Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are proposing, which is that everybody in this country gets Medicare or a new improved version of Medicare, without the privatized pieces and without the 20% hole in it and all that kind of stuff. And Emmanuel Says and Gabriel Zuckman, who are economists at the University of California, Berkeley, and have advised both the Warren and the Sanders campaigns, have a new book out. And they've pointed out that the wealthiest 400 Americans pay a lower tax rate than you do, even if you're poor, right? Even if you're in the bottom 50% of American income earners, even if you're in the bottom 10% of American income earners, you're actually paying a higher tax when you figure the payroll tax, which everybody making under $120,000 a year pays. When you figure, local property taxes, state taxes, fees. All the kinds of taxes that low-income people pay, they're paying an average of around 25%, the bottom 10% of Americans pay 25.6% of their total income in taxes. The 400 richest families in America pay 23%. They pay 3% less than the poorest Americans do. They say this is the tax system of a plutocracy. And I'll get into the details after the break, but the bottom line here is if we want to have, and I'm guessing that this will get brought up in tomorrow night's debate, if we want to have Medicare for all, we don't need to tax average working people. We need to roll back not just the Trump tax cuts and the Bush tax cuts. We need to roll back the Reagan tax cuts, and there'll be more than enough money to provide Medicare for all to everybody. And, the rich people can pay for it, for the whole country. And the corporations as well. I mean, they've got this massive tax break, too. I'll dig into the details right after the break. It's 18 minutes past the hour.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Or it will be 18 minutes past the hour in about 15 seconds. It's Thom Hartmann here with you. Talk media for the rest of us. And welcome back. Let me get back to that in just a moment and pick up some of your phone calls here. Patrick in Long Island, New York. Hey, Patrick, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, how are you? Great show. A lot of information. So much that I'm trying to collect my thoughts here. This country has always had political divides. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I remember the Vietnam War and the divisions that created. I saw these accelerate when Reagan was elected. We both know, I'm sure, of Nixon's attempts to play upon people's hate and dislike. So, but it increased after Reagan, and then the name calling started, and the economic inequality. And the Republican Party took advantage of this at every step they could.
Yep.
I don't recall the Democrats calling names. Okay, name calling has always gone on, but there's always been a polite limit to your name calling, yet the Republicans just trod forward, and then you have Fox News. And the only reason my feeling is that people go to a cult and stay in a cult is because it's meeting their needs. Or they think it's meeting their needs.
Well, typically it's providing them with safety, community, and
comfort.
Confirmation of identity.
I would agree 100%. And Mitt Romney has no reason to be in the Senate seat except to become a palatable substitute for Donald Trump among the Republicans. Mitt Romney will run, and all these people who in the last 10 years or so have become independents will suddenly say they're Republicans again. And the last thing, I'm on Medicaid myself. And if any type of requirement like that was brought forth to me with the 80 hours or whatever, I would physically not be able to perform that.
Right.
And that's why I get the Medicaid. And the Medicaid care is fantastic. I get quarterly checkups. I've had in-office surgery, and I don't get a bill.
That's great.
And I can't afford the bill. I get about $800 a month to live on.
Maybe instead of calling it Medicare for all, we should call it Medicaid for all, because Medicaid has not been partially privatized the way Medicare has.
And I hate to say it, but our neighbors to the north seem to be very happy, polite, well-adjusted people, and their first priority is to take care of your health.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And Tommy Douglas, the guy who was the premier of Saskatchewan, I believe, back in the day, in the 50s or 60s, was the guy who first did, single-payer health care in that province. And then it's spread across Canada. There's federal support for it, but it's actually administered by the individual states, and each program is slightly different, and their ID cards are slightly different, and which is how Bernie on this program was suggesting Medicare for all should be done back, 10 years ago. I don't know, exactly. I think now he's seen more of a national program, but the Canadians love it. I mean, Tommy Douglas is revered. He's one of the most he's dead now, but he's Kiefer Sutherland's grandfather, I believe. Or
really? That's interesting.
Yeah.
And one last thing, and now it's slipping my mind. Oh, I got your book on guns.
Oh, good. Good. Yeah.
Yes, I haven't gotten down, so it's not a large book, but I'm sure I could sit down in one evening and digest it all, and I will probably have a question or comment for you.
Okay, it's a weekend
Thanks
read,
a lot,
and there's a sequel to it now, which is The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. I hope you can check that out, Patrick. Thanks a lot for the call, and I don't mean that in the context of, gee, I'd like to sell another book, because, as you probably know, authors get virtually nothing from selling books. But there's some ideas in there that I think are really important, which is why I took the time and trouble to write the damn thing. We'll be right back. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Tennessee and So we were talking about health care and how Medicaid, and interestingly, I was just during the break talking with a fellow who was saying he's been on Medicaid for a couple of years. He's disabled, and it covers absolutely everything, no deductibles or anything, and it's working wonderful. And I'm thinking, Medicare has had so many holes drilled in it. It has that 20% carve out so that you have to have private insurance, you have to have Medigap insurance along with your Medicare, which is not particularly expensive, and it is pretty good. Mine is great. I mean, I have no copays, nothing. I would never go with one of these so-called Medicare Advantage programs because then you've got annual out-of-pockets that can be $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 a year. I have none of that, just being on regular Medicare. But, Medicare, they've privatized almost a third of Medicare, and, it's got all these holes drilled in it. Maybe we should be talking about Medicaid for all rather than Medicare for all, and expand the Medicaid program, which already exists in every state. I don't know. You don't have to be retired to be on Medicaid. A lot of the recipients of Medicaid are children. I believe as many as a quarter of all Medicaid recipients are children. So maybe it should be Medicaid for all. But that's a conversation to have, the next time Bernie calls in or whatever with those folks. So, but I was talking about how we are spending billions of dollars in health care and Medicaid here in Arkansas. The Republicans have now successfully thrown 18,000 people off the Medicaid rolls. Some of those people are dying. Many of those people are disabled. People die when Republicans do these policy things. And they do them in part because, they want to increase the profits of for-profit hospitals and pharmaceutical companies and whatnot. But I think more they do it because they're dancing to the ideology, this Koch, Mercer, Adelson, right-wing libertarian billionaire worldview, informed and animated by Ayn Rand with, Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead with her, bizarre teenage fantasy books about rich people should rule, right? And unions are parasites and all this kind of stuff. But in any case, as I was saying, Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman have basically laid it out. We'll cut your taxes, average working Americans, and we'll guarantee your health care. Ian Reifowitz for Daily Kos writes, how's that for a Democratic campaign pitch? And I think it's a pretty good one. Median household income, inflation adjusted for inflation, is actually lower right now, 2.3% lower than it was during the last year of Bill Clinton's presidency. But for the top 5% of households, it's up 13%. It's amazing. I mean, if they looked at, this was a GAO, the General Accounting Office, federal government, looked at how life expectancy. They started doing this in 1992. In 1992, they took a couple thousand people between 51 and 61 years old, and they just tracked them. They tracked them right up to 2014. And as of that year, the people in the top 20%, the wealthiest 20%, 3/4 of them were still alive. People of the poorest 20%, fewer than half of them were still alive. So poverty kills. And one of the largest pieces of how poverty kills is lack of access to health care. This has got to be a huge issue that I'm sure will be being discussed tomorrow night in the Democratic debates.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Meanwhile, I'm continuing my pitch for PGE to be taken over by the state of California. They are just evils of the privatization of the commons. In the Thom Hartmann Book Club today, we're reading from United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America and What We Can Do About It, by Nolan Higdon and Mickey Huff. And this is from the foreword by Ralph Nader. Ever since the few began to control the many, disinformation, fabrications, and distractions have been used to shape consent, impose submission, and maintain domination. Whether by the invoked authority of God, the divine right of kings,
the dictatorial embodiment of a fatherland, the dictatorship of the proletariat, or the tyranny of commercially managed marketplaces, the casualty of such control has always been the ability of ordinary people to give voice to their own realities, needs, demands, and grievances. Given the inherent pragmatism of the human mind, the oppressed have often found it safer to believe rather than to think, to obey rather than dissent. Today, such a path is reinforced by a plutocratic political economy that allows corporations to dominate mass media, education, and the production of knowledge and memory. Human history, however, has not been without its visionaries, seers, and prescient intellectuals, poets, artists, thinkers, and philosopher rebels. Every major religion admonishes its adherents not to allow the merchant class, with its singular focus on aggregating profits at the expense of truth, compassion, and self-restraint, to amass too much power. Such instructions have emanated not from revelation, but from ethics learned via the daily experience of living in community with others committed to the common good. Unfortunately, it has not been the transactional incentives of commerce, but the cooperative bonds of community that dominate the most significant acts of life in the United States today. The dystopian scenarios portrayed in George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World look like understatements compared to today's plutocratic deployment of communications technologies, many of them developed by taxpayer-funded government programs and grants. The ultimate success of top-down censorship is self-censorship by the people. The same holds true for mass surveillance. From radio and television to the internet and smartphones and all the video platforms and apps in between, commercially controlled media have used seduction and addiction to lure users to increasingly stare into screens and share personal data and location, thus becoming complicit with authoritarianism and mass surveillance. In the process, the population has become fact-deprived and over-entertained, with lowered expectation levels and reduced attention spans. These technology-driven changes have distracted people from their rights and powers as citizens. As authors Nolan Higdon and Mickey Huff write, long before Trump's candidacy, ratings drove programming and news. In the process, celebrity, entertainment, scandal, crime, disaster, and spectacle clearly dominated over substantive reporting, and public interest advocacy capable of questioning and countering abuses of corporate power and government authority. Trump, they noted, came right out of the omnipresent corporate commercialism. Deadly degradation of media is everywhere. Fueled by Madison Avenue's promotional perfidy, the junk food industry, bypassing parental authority, has lied its way directly into the stomachs of tens of millions of children, creating an obesity epidemic with its attendant diseases. Alternative facts, anyone? 45 years ago, venerated CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite called the 3 minutes or so devoted to a serious news story merely a headline service. If anything, the situation has worsened since Cronkite's time. Gone are the fairness doctrine, the right of reply, and any pretense that the Federal Communications Commission is regulating the broadcasters according to the 1934 Communication Act standard of the public interest, convenience, and necessity. The takeover of hundreds of newspapers, local television stations, and radio stations by corporate profiteers is still worsening. These corporations loot vulnerable media operations by cutting out reporters, investigative journalists, whistleblowers, educational content, and local coverage. Magazines are shrinking, going out of business, or just migrating to online-only versions. Social media cannot generate such content in addition to other shortcomings. Young people today are becoming increasingly illiterate. They spend more time staring at screens, but ultimately read less long-form content unless forced to do so for classwork. Fewer people are showing up for town meetings, marches, demonstrations, and rallies, in spite of the ease and immediacy of communication enabled by the internet. The so-called information age has become the disinformation age, with the corporate media's exclusion of the civic community being one of its most devastating triumphs. In the 1960s and 1970s, we could not have succeeded in advancing standards for public health and safety, labor, and environmental integrity without the help of mass media reporting on public campaigns and congressional hearings, or without large audiences tuning into programs such as the Phil Donahue Show, which dedicated airtime to discussing our investigations, reports, and exposés. Now it is not just corporate media, but the Congress itself that is increasingly shutting out citizens groups. The United States of Distraction by Higdon and Huff.
Thom Hartmann cruise will be sailing in July of 2020. The 7-day Oceania cruise will be going to Bermuda, and I'll be hosting onboard events about the topics of the day. More info at thomhartmann.com or 800-856-1155.
Welcome back. 34 minutes past the hour. Congressman Earl Blumenauer, he represents Portland, Democrat Oregon, but he represents mostly this area, has called for a boycott of the hotel chain that Gordon Sondland, who is the guy that gave $1 million to Trump's inaugural campaign, and in exchange for that, Trump made him ambassador to the European Union, but then he went over to the Ukraine to be... we don't know, right? Apparently, he was involved with Trump with that phone call to Zelensky and all this other kind of stuff. When he refused to testify last week, Earl Blumenauer actually tweeted out, "No one who cares about America should do business or stay at any of Gordon Sondland's hotels until he fulfills his duty as a citizen to testify. Here's a list of his hotels." And it got shared, far and wide, including by me. And, he's got quite a few hotels. This is the Provenance, Provenance, I realize it's a French word. I'm not sure if it's anglicized or spoken in, Provenance or I don't know how to say it. But anyway, some of the hotels in this area, there's a couple in Seattle, the Theodore and the Max, the Murano and Tacoma. But here in Portland, it's the Woodlark, the Dossier, the Lucia, the Heathman, the Deluxe, the Sentinel, and then there's others in Nashville and Boston and Palm Springs and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But anyway, we'll see. I mean, maybe after he testifies, he's going to testify this week, apparently, or at least he says he is. He's going to defy the State Department, in which case maybe it's time to book a room in one of his hotels. I don't know. We'll see how that all shakes out. But anyhow, I want to get to your calls here. Sue in Portland. Hey, Sue, what's on your mind today?
Oh, hi, Tom. I was listening just a few minutes ago to the stuff about Medicaid for all instead of Medicare for all. Mm-hmm. And that's something I've been saying for a year or so because, of course, my only experience is here in Oregon. But Medicaid is a much simpler. You have to kind of be under an HMO, but it's not like once you hit 65 and you go on Medicare, and then you have Medicaid as a backup. There's like all these different spend down things and donut holes and all the kinds of stuff that go with it. Right. But Medicaid is just simple. I mean, you have to get on it and apply and everything, but it's a much smoother deal trying to get things done.
It is, and it also pays for long-term elder care. And the problem is you have to bankrupt yourself first. But if we had Medicaid for all, of course, that would go away. So,
Yeah, and it would free up a lot of people to be able to do things other in their life besides, being afraid to get a part-time job or something because they're going to lose part of their Medicaid or whatever, And it's really, it's so necessary right now. But I think it's a much better system than the Medicare, which is very convoluted.
Which the Republicans are doing everything they can to destroy. I mean, aggressively. And these corporations, of course, are making a fortune on it, which is why they're able to buy television advertising. Whenever you see a television ad for a Medicare Advantage program, ask yourself, where the hell did they get the money to pay for that ad? They got it by telling somebody, oh, we're not actually going to pay for your care. Or we're going to kick you off the program because you just got sick. Sue, thank you. Very, very well said. Patrick in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Hey, Patrick, you grew up in a cult?
Hey, Tom. Yes, I did. And I don't need to get too specific. It was a form of Christianity, which is very popular. I think that people don't really completely understand the definition of the word cult. You know, the most common is like, you know, some kind of cryptic belief system.
Yeah, with Charles Manson, Jim Jones, that kind of weird stuff.
Exactly.
But really, I think you could argue that Catholicism is a cult, Mormonism is a cult, certainly Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists are cults. I think that they vary in how destructive they are. I think Seventh-day Adventists, for example, is a very productive cult. I know a lot about Seventh-day Adventists, and I know a lot of Adventists, or at least I used to. Anyway, back to you. I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Patrick.
I was actually excommunicated from the cult when I was pretty young because I would ask very critical questions about the dogma. And this is something that I have found about people who have, I'll use the term, resigned themselves to a certain cult membership, is they become very uncritical of people who have received the stamp of approval by the cult.
Right, well, that's an essential part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so now I look at my folks. My folks are still in this cult, and they voted for Kasich back in the day of 2016. But since Trump got all of the treatment that he's been getting, now they're fervently fans of Trump. And now I will just have like conversations kind of being like, oh, well, let's look at like the teachings of Christ and let's compare that. And it gets a lot of blowback. Right. And so what I find, and you were kind of talking about how do you deal with people who are like, the more caustic members of this kind of strange belief system, which we see people in our country possessing in regards to Trump cult membership, is what I find to be the most effective is to have knowledge of Scripture. As you love to refer to the 24th chapter of Matthew, which is a very powerful chapter to refer to when people are talking about how shall we conduct ourselves, what does it mean to be Christ-like, these things. It's really powerful if you can just pull out a simple Bible verse, because not only is it, the cornerstone of Western civilization, there's a lot of really good stuff in there. There's a lot of crazy stuff in there too, but hey, that's a lot of, it's a collection of books, right?
I think the Sermon on the Mount, which is Matthew, as I recall, like more or less 5 through 8, and Matthew 25, the part about the goats and the sheep, the parable of the goats and the sheep. If you want to know anything at all about Christianity, if you're not Christian, or even if you were raised Christian in a way that didn't introduce you to the Scriptures, just read those two things. I'm talking about a total, the part of Matthew 25 is 3 or 4 paragraphs, and the Sermon on the Mount is at the most 2 pages. And if you read those two things, you will understand the essence of what, at least from Jesus' point of view, Christianity was all about. You don't need to read Paul. I think Paul badly distorts Jesus' teachings, frankly. And I'm sure that there's, somebody who is deeply steeped in and trained in Jewish orthodoxy would be able to identify, well, here's a few scripture points to understand the core of Judaism. I'm sure that, there's similar things for Islam, and there's similar things for Buddhism and Hinduism. It's so simple. And in fact, it would be, how there's all these organizations that send out U.S. constitutions. You can get a free constitution from the Heritage Foundation and from, all these other groups. And sometimes they add stuff in the back of the Constitution to, promote their little shtick. But I've often thought that, back when I was more involved in religion, I thought about publishing a little tiny booklet that was just the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 25. And, without any commentary or anything, it would be, just a little pocket edition. It would be maybe 12 pages, and trying to widely distribute that, because it's just that really is the essence of the whole thing.
The Beatitudes, right?
Yeah, the Beatitudes is the Sermon on the Mount, yeah, absolutely. So, Patrick, good luck, or excuse me, congratulations on getting out of the cult. Good luck on deprogramming your parents. Keep us up to date on how it goes, okay?
Okay, thanks a lot, Tom.
Thanks a lot for the call. Good to hear from you. John in Minneapolis. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, I just wanted to run this by you. I do really fear what's going on politically now because we have this propagandized group of people that have, taken all this information in uncritically. And they're, I would say, almost a third of the electorate. We have...
You're talking the Trump cult?
Yeah, the Trump cult.
I don't think that's as much as a third, but yeah, okay, continue.
Yeah, we have a dictatorial presidency. I wouldn't call it even an imperial presidency. That would kind of put a nice spin on it. And then on top of that, we have a law enforcement and also within the military, people that are into the Trump cult, and they are allowed to continue on uncritically. Their superiors or other people are not correcting them that this is not correct. Like, for instance, when Donald Trump came here for his rally, the police department, under the direction of Bob Kroll, they wanted to wear their uniforms to a Trump rally. I mean, my wife worked for the federal government. My brother works for the federal government. You're not even allowed to really talk about politics, and you're not really allowed to be involved out in the public. You're supposed to be a civil servant, serving the Constitution of this country. And so you cannot be involved like that and be that boisterous about it. But I think that this is what we're seeing is a growth of, I hate to use this word because people don't like it, this is what you call fascism, the coming together of military power, police power, corporate power, and here we are. So, plus there's a big group of these people that have their arm to the hilt. It's just disgusting. I mean, this is what it is. I've known people that have lived through fascist regimes. I had a friend that lived in Chile. I knew somebody that survived the Russian Revolution, lived through World War II, lived in Vichy, France. There's no picnic, but, we can really kind of do something about it. I think you're doing quite a good service, and I wish that there were, that you were really supported more than you are, because these people, they're not challenged at all. We can't think about our political, the complexity of our political system anymore, and that's just what's going on, and it's very, very scary to me.
I think they're starting to get some pushback, and this video that was played at the Trump Doral at this rally that Don Trump Jr. is, you can take your picture with him for $2,500, but this video of the various media figures having being murdered by Donald Trump is maybe a turning point. We'll see. John, thank you. Well said.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
I also have friends who have lived through dictatorial regimes. Most of them actually, because I lived in Germany, lived through Hitler. And it's a scary time. And welcome back. Peter in Orlando watching us on Free Speech TV. Hey, Peter, what's on your mind today?
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
Well, thanks for taking my call. All right. So, what I want to cover is this, right? Well, first I want to state two facts and my personal views afterwards. Two facts is that, one, it is a proven fact that Trump got in touch with the Russians to try and get a dirt on Hillary. Second fact, he got in touch with the Ukraine leader, again, this time trying to get dirt on Joe Biden. Am I correct thus far or no?
Those facts are indeed facts, and there's no disputing either one of them. Trump openly asked Russia to help. Russia helped. Trump covertly asked the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, to help. And now the transcript, or a partial transcript of that, is available. And it's obvious that Trump said, yeah, you're absolutely right, Peter. Those facts are correct. Where are you going with that?
Now, personal views is this. Is it far-fetched to think that Trump also got information on Republican colleagues who were once his fiercest critics?
Oh, I think he's been blackmailing Lindsey Graham for a long, long time.
Yes, Rich McConnell and other Republicans, which would explain why they have now jumped on this Trump bandwagon.
Yeah, I think there's two Republicans in particular that I think clearly have been corrupted. Mitch McConnell got a couple $100 million for his state in exchange for doing away with the sanctions on the Ukrainian billionaire or Russian billionaire Oleg Deripaska. Yes. So he got paid off, and apparently money went also to his campaign and to his wife, who comes from apparently a billionaire shipping family. So McConnell was basically paid off, and I believe that Lindsey Graham is being threatened by some dimensions of his personal life being exposed by Donald Trump. But the other guys, they're afraid of primary challenges. And I'm suspecting that once by December, most states will have ended the opportunity to file a primary challenge against somebody. So these guys will know who is challenging them. And those senators, I believe, and members of the House for that matter, who don't have a primary challenger that they're afraid of, and don't have a serious challenger coming from the hard right, I suspect that those people are going to start turning against Trump. And then I think it's really going to pick up steam in March, April, May, which is why I think Trump may well be removed from office, and at which point Mitt Romney will step up and say, I'd like to be the nominee for 2020. Because once the primaries are over and they've won the primaries, and they know that now they're going into the general election, they're going to start viewing Trump as more of a liability than an asset. Trump may be able to bring along 15, 20, 25% of the Republican base, but that's not going to be enough to get elected, to the United States Senate in most states. So I think the worm is about to turn here, Peter. I mean, I may be wrong, but we'll see.
I certainly hope it leads from your lips to God's ears.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Peter, thank you for the call. Thoughtful analysis. I appreciate it. We'll be right back. It's coming up on, it is 10 minutes before the hour. Stick around. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And wow, what a day, and so much. Will in Broomfield, Colorado. It says your dad is in the Trump cult.
Very much so. And I got to say this: I love my father-in-law. Father-in-law. I love him very much. He's a great guy, but he is very much a member of the Trump cult, and he's been a member of this cult really his whole life. Trump is just the figurehead of a Republican cult that extends back decades.
Oh yeah, it goes back to McCarthy in the 50s. What do you? I mean, typically the things that principally motivate people are, for men, it's wanting to control women, the whole abortion issue. For women, it can be some dimension of that. Basically, Phyllis Schlafly said most women would like to go back to being protected and taken care of by their husbands.
Home security.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not quite sure how to describe it, but and then of course there's the white supremacy piece of it that's huge, and then there's the authoritarian. I want to be an authoritarian follower. I want a strong leader part. Trump is running this ad on CNN right now, saying I'm a tough man for tough times. What is it with your father-in-law?
Well, he was born in rural Colorado. Didn't have much of a formal education, so that makes him very suspicious of people with book smarts as opposed to, quote, street smarts, and using air quotes there.
Right.
He was career military, very deferential to people in authority, and again, I'm using the word authority in air quotes.
Right.
And he's been a Mormon all his life, which is very evangelical Christianity, even though evangelicals won't admit it. His whole life, the person with authority says something, and you literally treat it as...
So he's an authoritarian follower who has found in the Trump cult an authoritarian hierarchy with which he feels comfortable, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is
I think that's
exactly.
probably the most common Trump follower. I may be wrong, but because I haven't seen any good comprehensive analysis of and I'm sure sociologists will be doing this for years. But go ahead.
You had one of your callers. I think you had two guys named Patrick. The first one who called about his parents still being in the cult.
Mm-hmm.
He sounded exactly like somebody who's been in the LDS Church.
Yeah,
I know people like him. I know I went to the LDS Church myself.
Yeah, LDS Latter-day Saints. These are Mormons. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and it's a very, very cult-like atmosphere. And by cult-like, I mean like you are extremely deferential to a person in authority. You don't even...
Well, and there's all the secret rituals and the secret underwear that you wear when you go to the temple. But on the other hand, there's also a benevolent side to Mormonism. If you are poor, if you are hungry, and you are a Mormon, you're part of the group. The church will reach out and take care of you.
Exactly.
But that's a very seductive thing. I mean, that's community.
Yeah, well, so does the Catholic Church, but I would also call the Catholic Church
not as effectively. Catholic. I don't think that members.
Well, deferential to the Pope.
Yeah. No. I'm talking about the local, and maybe I'm wrong about this because I've never been inside either the Mormon Church or the Catholic Church, but I've had Mormon friends who have told me that if they fall on hard times, they can go to their local congregation, and those folks will basically raise money to help them pay their rent, or will find food for them, or will take them in even.
Well, I've been in both churches, and I can say that is true, but it also comes at a price. If you go to
check your mind at the door.
Your bishop, yeah, that's one of them. Second thing is that if you go to your Mormon bishop for help, in return for the help, you are expected to be more effective when you toe the line. And I can say that from personal experience.
Yeah. So
you go more often.
You get to be an evangelist, one of those guys who goes door to door. Once we put you back together, something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Will, thanks a lot for the call. It's great to hear from you. It's fascinating to hear these stories from people who've been on the inside, because this is exactly what Trump is doing. And this is, by the way, it's what Hitler did. It's what Tojo did. It is, this cult leader as political figure is the most dangerous and toxic combination that exists, period, bar none. And we need to understand it. Don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. Get out there, get active, tag, you're it. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.